Okay. By my clock, it says it's 4:01, so we'll call the meeting to order. And I'll start by saying the City of London is committed to making every effort to provide alternate formats and communication supports for council, standing or advisory committee meetings, and information upon request. To make a request for any city service, please contact accessibility@london.ca or 519-661-2489, extension 2425. To make a specific request to this meeting, please contact pec@london.ca. And with that, I will look for disclosures of conflict from committee. I am not seeing any. So we have a number of consent items, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Would committee wish to pull any of those? And if not, we'll need a motion. Councillor Hopkins.
I'd be happy to move the consent items. I would like to make a comment, though, on 2.5.
Councillor Deputy Mayor Helmer.
Thank you. I'd like to pull 2.1 and 2.5.
Okay, so Councillor Hopkins, therefore, is moving all items except for 2.1 and 2.5, seconded, I'm assuming, by the Deputy Mayor?
Yep.
Yes. And any comments on those items? Building Division Monthly Report, is there no comments? Okay, so I'll call the question on all the consent except for 2.1 and 2.5.
Closing the vote, the motion carries 3-0.
Okay, that brings us to item 2.1, Deputy Mayor Helmer.
Okay, so through the chair, I have a question about this one. I know we've dealt with it before. This is a slightly different approach. I read the report and I'm sort of leaning towards going along with this suggestion, but I wonder about this, having a staff person making the appointments to the panel. There's a reference there saying lots of other municipalities do this. Can you give me some examples to kind of put my mind at ease that this is a kind of practice that we see in other places?
Mr. Yeoman.
Through you, Madam Chair, happy to do that. So in terms of what's proposed here, so just for the committee's benefit, so the recommendation is a revision to have the panel members appointed by the Director of Development Services and then conflicts adjudicated by a conduct review committee, which would be composed of the Managing Director of Development and Compliance, the Director of Development Services, and the Director of City Planning as well. In terms of looking at other municipalities, so staff appointment of panel members, and then also the advisory, or the committee being an advisory committee to staff, is the case for Mississauga, Burlington, and Brampton. Also, the Toronto, Hamilton, Ottawa, and Vaughan all have the panel as being an advisory committee to staff, not to council as well. I couldn't find, though, whether or not those are actually appointed by staff, but my hunch is as well. Vaughan, however, is appointed by council.
Good, Council. All right, Deputy Mayor.
Yeah, so I'll move it. I think it's something I'm not against trying it. We just made the appointment, so in sort of the short term, it's not going to be much different. And I think that the way of resolving the conflict issues is better than what was proposed before, so I'm glad we waited. I know I was kind of against waiting, but it seems like we've actually found a better way forward, and then I think we'll have to see how it goes. I don't really have a problem with council making the appointments, and I've always understood it to be a committee that's advising planning and development services staff and giving their feedback. I'm a little cautious. Sometimes the committee needs to tell staff things they don't want to hear, really. and I want to make sure that that independence remains. And that's why I was asking about the appointments. Sometimes it's hard to tell the person who's appointing you. They're like, I don't agree with you and this is bad urban design. So yeah, I think we'll have to see how it goes.
Thank you. So moved by Deputy Mayor Helmer and seconded by Councillor Hopkins. I'll call the vote.
Closing the vote, the motion carries 3-0.
Okay, that brings us to item 2.5. Both both Councillor Hopkins and the Deputy Mayor wanted to speak on this. I'll go to Councillor Hopkins first.
Sure. I just really appreciated the report. Having this report is very, very helpful. Those were the comments. I was really pleased to see that development applications as well are improving, and that I love the maps, by the way. Those little blobs where development is occurring as we go forward. I do have a quick question. Given that this is an update from 2019, which is the other really important part of getting this reported, it's relevant. Can we expect updates sort of in the first quarter, say January or February of each year to the previous year? Because I think if we get too far down the line, these reports may not be as important as they are when they're updated.
Through you, Madam Chair, so our intention is to bring this forward every year, generally in January, February, early February at the latest. We have that date because that's when we can actually pull the information for year end, the previous year. We're also using this information to set up for the growth management implementation strategy kickoff that we do with the stakeholders as well. We've historically provided a lot of this information to that group that then informs the GMIS report that comes before you. So this is a bit of an enhancement with that, but we want to make sure it's ready for that conversation as well, because it's an important feed into the decision-making on infrastructure that's before you.
Thank you for that. I like that process. Could you remind me when the GMIS is coming to us as well?
Through you, Madam Chair, so we do have a formal process that's consistent each year. We have the kickoff with the stakeholders in February of each year. From there, we do interviews with the various stakeholders. We come back with a draft after we've had a chance to digest it internally. We make some proposals, they receive some further feedback, and then come to you usually in May with a recommendation to inform the budget in the fall.
Deputy Mayor Helmer.
Thank you. This is a great report. Very helpful, you know, really not very long, but I think is focusing in on the key things to be keeping track of. I found myself when I was looking at the maps, of course, wondering where the built area boundary was, so I could see which things were on what side of the line and how we're doing in terms of the intensification target, which will be no surprise, I don't think, to anybody. And in fact, I think we need to be adding that in to future reports so that, you know, when we're going to say, okay, where's all this development happening across all the different kinds of residential units, also, you know, are we on track for the residential intensification target or not? And how are we sort of making progress there? So I've suggested some language. Hopefully there's a seconder for this, but that in future reports, we just have some sense of what's inside and outside the built area boundary as defined in the London plan. And then we can include that in the reports. I personally would like to see it for all the different types of residential units, but you guys can handle that level of detail. I don't know if Councillor Hopkins wants to second that.
I think I'd be pleased to second that.
And just to comment a little bit more about the actual report and what it's showing us, I think it's really helpful to see the 5-year average and the 10-year average for the different kinds of units, and also what the forecast is and how we've been faring in terms of, do we meet that target in the forecast? How accurate is the forecasting? And, you know, this is a hard thing, and I have sounded like a broken record a number of times saying the low density residential is under, look at that, it's under again, it's under again, and we have medium density and high density over a lot of the time. And especially when we look ahead, it seems to me like the 10-year average is going to be low. Like that's the low boundary for high density residential. And we're over that consistently the last couple of years. So, you know, I think when we're thinking about the finance implications of this, you know, are we doing the DC splits appropriately? Are we collecting all the revenue we actually need for the growth related works if the low density residential is going to be under? I'm very concerned about that. I know we deal with that in other areas, but I think in this report, it's really showing on the sort of on the ground reality of what's being built and how it's tracking against the forecast. So I think it's really helpful. I think this is I don't want to make it a lot longer. I think it's really getting at the key information and a good supplement to all the other information we get, you know, the GMIS and the development charges monitoring stuff that we do. So thanks very much for bringing it forward, and in such a timely way too. I mean, the year just ended and here we are with the report. I think it's wonderful.
Through Madam Chair, just a quick point to that. So the low-density residential and high-density residential actuals are something we are monitoring. We, of course, are monitoring that in relation to what it means for our infrastructure planning as well. What we're not clear on yet, and that's why we talk about how we're monitoring it here, is whether or not these are actual trends yet. We've only had a couple years of this experience. We do know that in terms of low-density residential, we were anticipating there might be a bit of a bottleneck in relation to supply for this year and the previous year. We do know, though, that there are a number of plans that have been registered within the last year that are going to actually bring a lot more units potentially onto market. We'll see how that then impacts demand as well. We also do know that in terms of high-density residential, that the vacancy rate has been quite low, and so the market's responding to that as well. So we're interested to see whether that will maintain with its cyclical nature as well. So very good observations.
Well, I do think we need to be careful about, anticipating where things are going to go. And I do think that there's a lot of stuff, especially in the Southwest, that, if that starts getting built, it's going to change these numbers quite substantially when that does happen. But, just looking over what is this, a 20-year period? No, 10-year period, back to 2010. There's only really 1 year where low-density residential was really within reaching distance of the target, right? And that was 2017, 1 out of 10 years. So I think that's a pretty well-established trend, which is it's under. It's just a matter of how much under, right? And I think that's something we have to keep in mind as we're thinking about all these other things that might be coming in the future. I do think that there will be a lot of low density, just knowing what's in the hopper.
Great, so we have a motion from the Deputy Mayor to receive the report and plus the added part. And it's moved by the Deputy Mayor, seconded by Councillor Hopkins. What is the added part of the motion? Can you read that, clerk?
The added is the civic administration be directed to include in future annual development reports the percentage of residential units within the built area boundary as defined in the London Plan to aid in tracking progress towards the 45% intensification target.
No further comments. I'll call the vote.
Closing the vote, the motion carries 3-0.
Okay, that brings us to scheduled items, and item 3.1 is a delegation from the chair of the Environmental and Ecological Planning Advisory Committee, Mr. Sandy Levin. Come to the podium, and do we have a presentation, Mr. Levin, or just verbal?
Very brief, actually, Madam Chair and members of committee. Call your attention to our report on page 77. This is in response to some work that you had asked the committee to go out and try and get a little bit of information about how to bring more information to the land development process in terms of the challenge when a landowner doesn't permit investigations on his or her land. And what we discovered in talking to a number of consultants in the field, including an environmental consultant for a large firm the city uses, who does work throughout Ontario, is that your response rate will go up if you make personal approaches to landowners. The current practice is really just to mail a letter. So it's very difficult generally for the landowner to understand what's the reason for this, where he or she will benefit from participating in the process. Doesn't guarantee in any way, shape, or form that you'll get everybody on side, but it does increase the participation rate. The challenge with that piece is that it's a little more expensive. You may have to make multiple visits to a particular landowner in order to get that person's cooperation. But it does provide then more information when you're doing the work. And I'll provide you with an example that EPAC participated in a scoping meeting recently, and this highlights where it becomes really important. This is a site on Southdale Road, west of Bostwick, where there is a wet feature, a wetland, and this particular parcel here is owned by one landowner, and this parcel here by another. My understanding actually that many of these lands in this particular area are owned by one landowner. So conceptually, if you did some sort of secondary plan, you might be able to get more of the data more effectively at one time. But what's happening here is that this particular landowner isn't ready. So the hydrogeological work for the wetland is being done just at the property line here. There's no boreholes being dug in any other place. How you get hydrogeological data from one side of a wet feature, I'm not clear on. I'm not sure you can. And how can you then approve the particular individual's proposal without that data? You also then have the issue of the impact on the wooded feature here, and any amphibian surveys are also going to be somewhat off time because you're doing it on one side and not the other. So I've raised the issue with Mr. Yeomans that there should be an effort to be able to bring the data in comprehensively, which is to benefit of everybody in the development process and everybody in the ecological process, because you know what features you need to protect, how best to mitigate, and so on. So I leave that and the rest of the report for the committee.
Thank you, Mr. Levin. Any questions for the delegate? Councillor Hopkins.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Levin. I guess I'd like to hear a little bit about, from staff, about our process. And I just wanted to also know, because I've known in the past with some areas that staff have not been able to attend on, that there could be possibilities of having drones or something like that. I'm just not sure what we're able to do as a municipality or not. I just would like a little bit more feedback from staff.
Through you, Madam Chair. So my understanding is that we're only really allowed to look at the environmental features that are related to the lands that are under application. We have had challenges, as Mr. Levin has indicated, as we've talked about we talked about a committee with this. That doesn't make sense, but anyway, as we've been speaking about this, about the challenges that we have with access to land, and about how then you have to make a number of assumptions through your EIS about upstream or downstream implications associated with the systems that we have. We are looking at this through the Environmental Management Guidelines review. That is the appropriate forum to do that. Our EMG is well over 10 years old, and thankfully it's being looked at right now a lot more comprehensively. It's perhaps not as tight as it could be, and so we're looking for some options there. So I think that's probably the best forum for it to be addressed in the future.
Just as a follow-up, so can we expect that review, or when can we expect that review coming back to us? And are we regulated in any way as a municipality when it comes to using drones to do surveys of properties that we're not able to go on but need to get that information?
Through the chair, the environmental management guideline process is underway now. We're anticipating getting to you near the end of this year with any recommended changes. Just to reiterate, though, a couple of comments Mr. Yeoman made. First of all, you only review the lands that are part of the application, but certainly trying to understand impacts from features that are off-site is something that we will look at from the EMGs. Mr. Levin's comment with respect to alternate ways of trying to engage other landowners, personal visit other than just the letters, we can certainly follow up on. Because I don't want it left with the committee that, in fact, we do not seek landowners' approval from all of the areas that could be considered. We, in fact, do that, but certainly looking at personal outreach on top of the letters is something we can follow up on. I don't want to provide a comment on the second part because, again, it would depend on the feature and what it is that you're looking for. So the example that Mr. Levin gave with respect to doing hydrological investigation, you're not going to get much information from a drone overfly. So it would be dependent on the feature that you're looking for the information for.
Okay, we're good. I just want to thank you again for coming, Mr. Levin, and also, I know in other situations where our standard procedure was just to send a letter from the city, when we just tweaked that a little bit and made phone calls, it makes a really big difference. So thank you for bringing that suggestion, and thanks to staff for making it part of your review. So with that, we will receive the delegation from Mr. Levin, moved by Deputy Mayor Helmer, seconded by Councillor Hopkins, and I'll call the vote.
Closing the vote, the motion carries 3-0.
Brings us to item 3.2, which is a public participation meeting regarding 464 to 466 Dufferin Avenue and 499 Maitland Street. Can I have a motion to open? Deputy Mayor Helmer, seconded by Councillor Hopkins, and we can vote on that.
Closing the vote, the motion carries 3-0.
Okay, before we get started, I'll look to the public gallery. This is regarding 464 to 466 Dufferin Avenue and 499 Maitland Street, an official plan amendment, I believe. And I just want to see if there's anybody in the public gallery who is here who is interested in this item here to hear about it, speak to it, the applicant. We've got some members of the public. Okay, so I'll go to Ms. Vivian first and go ahead with your staff presentation.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So this is an official plan and zoning bylaw amendment application pertaining to the property municipally addressed as 464 to 466 Dufferin Avenue and 499 Maitland Street. So the subject site is located at the northwest corner of the intersection at Dufferin Avenue and Maitland Street. The site is rectangular in shape and is just over 300 square meters in area and currently contains an existing mixed-use building consisting of vacant commercial space and 5 residential units. The site is also surrounded by various residential uses to the north, east, south, and west. So the applicant is proposing to utilize the existing commercial space on the main floor for an eat-in restaurant use. So 1 residential unit is being removed as a result of the proposed use. However, 4 residential units will be maintained by way of a special provision. So the applicant is requesting to add specific policies to the London Plan and the 1989 official plan to add an eat-in restaurant use as a permitted use within the zoning. So the requested zoning bylaw amendment is to rezone the subject property to a residential R3 convenience commercial special provision zone to add an eat-in restaurant within the ground floor of the existing building, together with at least 4 dwelling units as the additional permitted use. So they're also requesting additional special provisions to regulate a maximum gross floor area for the commercial uses, to recognize a minimum of 2 parking spaces as existing, and also recognize existing site conditions such as lot coverage, landscape open space, a minimum parking area, and maintain all existing setbacks as existing on the day of the passing of the bylaw. So for a bit of a policy context, the site is located within the low-density residential designation of the 1989 official plan, as well as the neighborhoods place type of the London Plan, and is currently zoned residential R3 with a convenience commercial zone on there as well. And it's also located within the East Woodfield Heritage Conservation District. So the recommended specific policy areas, so the recommended amendments would maintain the existing low-density residential designation and the neighborhood's place type while allowing for a new convenience commercial use, which is considered to be compatible with the existing neighborhood. The eat-in restaurant use will occupy the existing heritage building that was purpose-built for commercial uses, which has been vacant for a number of years. The proposed added use will operate within the existing building to maximum size of 230 square meters and is not anticipated to cause any adverse impacts on nearby residential uses. So in terms of intensity, the site has historically been used as an appropriate location for commercial use where the proposed added use further preserves that heritage building. So in terms of parking on site is an existing situation where the subject property is located in close proximity to downtown, which provides alternative methods of travel. The subject site location also allows for the opportunity for on-street parking along Maitland Street and within the surrounding neighborhood. It should also be noted that uses permitted as of right, such as a personal service establishment, share the same parking standards as the requested eat-in restaurant use. as well as the size and shape of the existing parcel, has the ability to accommodate the intensity of the proposed Eden restaurant use. So as such, the recommended amendment is consistent with the provincial policy statement and conforms to the in-force policies of the London Plan and the 1989 official plan. The recommended amendment to the London Plan and the 1989 official plan through a specific policy area to the neighborhood's place type and a Chapter 10 policies for specific areas will add an Eden restaurant use as a permitted use on the subject property. The recommended amendment is also consistent with the East Woodfield Heritage Conservation District and will further facilitate the use of an existing heritage building that is complementary to the existing neighborhood and provides a commercial component for the surrounding community. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Any technical questions for staff? No? Is the applicant here? Do you have a comment?
Zolinka Priamo, and I'm representing the landowner for this application. Thanks for the opportunity to provide comments. We agree with staff's recommendation. I understand that there are a number of public comments which I may be able to address. There was a comment about plumbing. I may be able to speak with that individual later after this meeting. There were a number of concerns about parking, which Ms. Vivian has noted that's an existing situation, and we're really not looking to change that right now. So we do support the staff's recommendation for approval and be happy to answer any questions the committee may have.
Thank you. Any technical questions for the applicant? No? Any members of the public who would wish to comment on this application? Yep, come to the microphone, state, yeah, state your name and then you'll have 5 minutes.
Okay. My name is Janice Lemieux, and I'm happy that the restaurant is going in there. My main concern is parking. I live at, I don't know whether you've got the map up, I live at 484 Dufferin, which is between Prospect and Maitland. And on the north side, there is no parking. On the south side, there is 2-hour parking. My concern is that it remains the same because I have difficulty getting out of my driveway between Prospect and Maitland. And Maitland goes straight through, so I've got the traffic going east and west on Dufferin, plus coming out of Prospect, plus coming over Maitland, and I have a difficulty getting out of there. If somebody's parking on the north side, I would not be able to get out of there. And there is no parking there. I just want to make sure that that stays the same. Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any other members of the public who would like to comment on this application? Oh, there's a microphone up and down. So state your name and you will have 5 minutes.
Marcus Coles. I am generally pleased with the use of the building, but parking bothers me. And it didn't initially bother me, but talking to people in the neighborhood, it seemed to be a concern. And another concern is directly across the street, it appears to be going to be stuck being a 9-unit residential building with no parking. And that's going to further load the parking situation in the adjacent streets. I think that maybe that development, which has recently more or less been forced on the neighborhood by the OMB decision, shouldn't sort of slide below the radar. The other thing, which I don't think the restaurant will conflict too badly with, is that Maitland Street through there is heavily used for pickup and delivery of children for Lord Roberts School. So my only worry is parking. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Anybody else? Any other comments regarding this?
I thought this would come up tonight. So, I mean, we do this all the time in my neighborhood. People figure the parking out without any problems. We have many restaurants which have 0 parking spaces, and we survive. I guess really the only reason I want to speak is that, you know, this again highlights why are they having to apply for, I assume this is a reduction in parking spaces. Is it not time this city kind of ends its reliance on parking minimums that we're requiring people to have? Every time they have to come here and ask for permission to reduce the number of parking spaces, I think most businesses and I think most residential owners are going to, or best know how many parking spaces they need. If they need more, they're not going to build. If they think it's a viable business, then they're going to build parking or no parking. So I think it's time the city start to revisits this case and is highlighted again that parking minimums don't seem to be a good idea to move forward as a city. Thanks.
Thank you. Any other comments from the public? Go ahead, microphone, 5 minutes.
Hi, my name is Kate Rabson. I'm representing the Woodfield Community Association, and we haven't spent a whole lot of time on this particular application, but I just wanted to comment, having looked at some of the comments on the minutes tonight from some neighbors, I haven't really heard a lot about some of the site plan specific issues like garbage storage and removal and recycling. Those are sort of some little problems that could come up in a high density residential neighborhood when there's sort of a commercial use plopped in the middle of it that might produce more garbage and recycling and also delivery of food trucks and that sort of thing. So I just wondered like how that was being addressed, how those issues and concerns were being addressed in the application. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other comments? One more time, any other members of the public here to comment on this particular item? I'm not seeing any, so I'll go to committee to close the public participation meeting. Moved by Councillor Hopkins, seconded by Deputy Mayor Helmer. We'll vote on that.
Closing the vote, the motion carries 3-0.
Thank you. So I had a couple of questions written down that came out of the PPM. First of all is why did the applicant have to come forward with this application? Was it only because of the not meeting the minimum parking requirements?
Through you, Madam Chair. So the applicant had to come forward just based on the policies outlined within the official plan, the London plan, as well as the zoning bylaw. The Eden restaurant use is contemplated within the 89 official plan. However, it's up to a certain size where this was not meeting that size requirement. As well within the London plan with the mixed-use building, it being considered as such was not permitted at this location, also requiring that amendment. In terms of the rezoning, the convenience commercial zone that's existing on the property also did not contemplate an Eden restaurant use, requiring the applicant to then add that use as a special provision. And through this process, we recognized a bunch of the existing conditions of the site, which included the parking.
Thank you for that. There were also some questions related to the site plan, and I know this is not the site plan part of the process, but does the application speak to things such as garbage storage and or deliveries?
Through you, Madam Chair, this is an existing commercial site, or mixed-use site, I should say. So the application itself would not be subject to site plan approval. However, we could take the items that have been brought to our attention by the community and take that back to the applicant to work through that with them.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for that. So I'll go to committee now. Are there any comments or questions from committee? Councillor Hopkins.
Yes, thank you. And through you, Madam Chair, to staff, I have a question about the on-street parking. Is parking allowed on the street or not? Just further clarification.
Through you, Madam Chair, there is parking along Maitland Street on the east side, if I'm being oriented correctly here. If you're facing towards the public school, there is 2-hour parking along that side. And further, where Maitland Street then also intersects with Dufferin further to the east, I believe there's parking along there as well.
Deputy Mayor.
There was a specific question about whether parking was going to be changing along some of these streets, especially close to the one intersection. And I just wonder if somebody, I don't know if there's someone from transportation who wants to talk about that, but it's actually kind of further away from the subject site, but there was a question about that, and I think we should try and get an answer if we can.
And my apologies for not catching that one. Mr. Yeoman.
Through you, Madam Chair, I'll do my best. Our colleagues in Transportation Planning unfortunately couldn't be with us tonight. As a result of this application, there is no proposal to change the parking in the area that's directly related to this. There is a process that we go through publicly about changing parking in an area. The area residents are notified. I don't have the specifics on that, but we can provide that for members of council in advance of council.
One thing I'll say too is there's a general prohibition about parking within 20 meters of an intersection, which, you know, that's not going to change from this application or anything like that. So I just looked where the subject property was. The person who lives at the one property who was concerned is quite close to the intersection, and I could see why it might be concerned if there's going to be more parking in around the exit that she has from her property. So it doesn't seem very likely to me that anything would be changing there.
Thank you. Councillor Van Holst, welcome.
Oh, thank you, Madam Chair. See, we may get a new restaurant in the neighborhood. It's not the same as a pecuniary interest, but I'm kind of hungry, so that might incline me to support this at council. Thank you.
Thank you, any other comments from committee? No. So I'll need a motion. Deputy Mayor is moving the staff recommendation and seconded by Councillor Hopkins. No surprise. So I'll call the vote.
Closing the vote, the motion carries 3-0.
Okay, that brings us to item 3.3, which is another public participation meeting regarding 6682 Fisher Lane. And I need a motion to open the PPM. Moved by Councillor Hopkins, seconded by Deputy Mayor Helmer. We can vote.
Closing the vote, the motion carries 3-0.
Okay, so I'll go to the gallery to see if any members of the public are here specifically for this item, which is 6682 Fisher Lane. Any members of the public interested in this application, 6682 Fisher Lane? I'm not seeing any interest in the gallery. So committee, would you like a full staff presentation on this? I think we're good with the report. I believe Ms. Campbell would like to comment first.
Thank you, Madam Chair. If I could just introduce Monica Wu to the committee. Monica is a planner with Development Services and Current Planning. She's been with us since September of 2019. She primarily has been assisting with minor variances and consent applications, and this is her first appearance before Planning Environment Committee. So I'd like to welcome Monica.
Thank you, and welcome, Ms. Wu. If you can just give us a brief couple of minutes description of what this planning application is all about.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The application is a zoning bylaw amendment for the property known municipally as 6682 Fisher Lane. The subject lands are located at the south end of the city, just north of the intersection of Wellington Road South and Fisher Lane. The requested amendment is to extend the temporary T-77 zone for an additional 2-year period. The temporary zone was approved by council on April 23rd of last year and permits the use of the lands for 2 single detached dwellings and a maximum lot coverage of 12%, not exceeding 6 months. So the temporary zone is required to facilitate the unique situation of transporting an existing single detached dwelling to the site and then rebuilding it. And this will be done prior to the demolition of the original dwelling that exists on the site. The applicant is requesting additional time as unforeseen damages were incurred during the relocation process. So staff has received 1 comment from a neighboring property owner in support of the application. No new development is being proposed as part of the application, and no new impacts will be created as a result of this extension. As such, Development Services is recommending approval of the extension to the temporary T-77 zone for a period for a maximum period of 2 years. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And is the applicant here? Not seen, which is fine. Does any member of the public wish to comment on this application? No comments from anybody in the gallery. I guess we can have a motion to close the public participation meeting. Moved by Councillor Hopkins, seconded by Deputy Mayor Helmer, and we'll vote on that.
Closing the vote, the motion carries 3-0.
Thank you again, Ms. Wu. Are there any questions or comments from committee? Deputy Mayor Helmer.
Thank you. A bit of an unusual situation. In retrospect, I feel like 6 months might have been a bit short. You know, it was maybe optimistic to think that everything would go smoothly. Is this really the only option, is to come forward with a request for an amendment to extend it? There's no option to go to like a minor variance to extend the temporary zone or something like that? I know it's before us now, so I mean, well, I'll deal with it and I support the idea, but I certainly will be conscious about the time limitation if we see something like this again. I mean, it's the first one I've seen, but it's not the cheapest thing in the world to come forward and ask for an amendment and all this stuff. So I wonder if our staff have any comments about that. Is this really the only route available to the applicant?
Through you, Madam Chair, minor variance applications have certain criteria that we would consider through that process. It would be a challenge to look at this application as meeting the intent of a temporary zone, since a fixture of the temporary zone is that time period. So this would be the best approach to deal with it. With regards to the cost of an application, temporary zone does have a reduced cost relative to a typical full rezoning application. So there may not be as significant savings between the extension of the temporary use zone versus a minor variance in this particular interest.
Any other comments or questions? No? Can I have a motion? Moved by Deputy Mayor Helmer, is moving the staff recommendation, seconded by Councillor Hopkins, and I'll call the vote.
Closing the vote, the motion carries 3-0.
That brings us to item 3.4, which is another public participation meeting, and this one concerns the Victoria Park secondary plan. Can I have a motion to open the public participation meeting, moved by Councillor Hopkins, seconded by Deputy Mayor Helmer? I'll call the vote.
Closing the vote, the motion carries 3-0.
And go ahead, Ms. Kinnearium.
Excellent. So thanks so much. So I will try and keep this to 5 minutes, and if you have any questions, please let me know after. So we're here today recommending adoption of the Victoria Park Secondary Plan. We're also going to be recommending amendments to specific policies in the for the Woodfield neighborhood in the London Plan and the 89 official plan. And we're going to be recommending the review of the properties in the North Policy Area for designation under the Ontario Heritage Act. So as you can see here, the existing policy framework is very varied for the lands around Victoria Park, but never before have the lands been looked at holistically and comprehensively based on their relationship to the park. We've had an extensive community engagement. This has been going on for over a year and a half. We've had over 190 interested parties. We've had virtual reality exhibits, community information meetings. We've been at the park, in festivals, and we've had a Get Involved website. So the Victoria Park Secondary Plan has involved balancing a variety of factors, trying to get intensification and sort of combat climate change while ensuring appropriate transition and heritage conservation, all while recognizing and continuing to have the park as a very prominent feature in the City of London. So you can see here the study area, so it's all the properties surrounding the park. Many of them are covered by surface parking lots, so there are definitely opportunities for intensification, but the question here is, what will that intensification look like? So in terms of view corridors, these policies are relatively unchanged since we saw the draft secondary plan. They really focus on connecting through to Richmond Street, to Woodfield, and also having views to and from St. Peter's Basilica Cathedral, recognizing it's such an important landmark. We also have connections, looking at connecting through to Richmond Street and connecting through to the Woodfield neighborhood. These policies, again, are relatively unchanged since the draft secondary plan. We have the public realm section. So the public realm section, again, continues to focus on really expanding that greening of the park into the surrounding neighborhood. One policy that was added is to retain some form of public space on the City Hall site. So R.H. Cooper Square, we've heard mixed feedback about it, but there seems to be this this desire for some form of public space, civic public space, to remain in that area. And then also in terms of cultural heritage, our policies continue to focus on conserving and compatibility of any new development with heritage resources. And the policies of the West Woodfield and downtown heritage conservation districts would continue to apply. We have added the requirement for a heritage impact assessment with all new applications. In terms of the built form, this is where we start to see some of the big changes in the plan. What we heard through the consultation process was this desire that we should really be looking at the impact. We should really be taking scientific measures, not just assigning particular heights, but having a rationale and a reason and really focusing on how to mitigate impacts. So one thing we've applied is this angular plane criteria. So if you have a low density designation in the 1989 official plan or neighborhoods place type in the London plan, you take it from that property line, you go up 10.5 meters, because that's the height one would expect of a single detached dwelling in the area, and then you go up 45 degrees. And so new development could be within that angular plane. We've also imposed shadow limits, so there's certain design features such as limited floor plate sizes and building separation distances and step backs that will help to contribute to minimizing shadow. But then also that recognizing how important that concrete pad in front of the band shell is, imposing criteria that no more than 25% of it can be in shadow at any one time between 8 and 4 from June 1st to August 31st, so really when we're having those festivals. So the building heights, you'll see here, they have changed slightly from the draft secondary plan. You continue to see the highest heights in the south policy area. And then in the east policy area, these heights are really regulated by that angular plane. So on the City Hall site, in the south part of the parking lot of 556 Wellington, you could have up to 30 stories, provided it's within that angular plane, which it could be. And then you also have the heights for B and C are regulated by that angular plane. So that is the 560 Wellington and then the north part of 556 Wellington. So that would get you approximately 8 stories. And then in the north policy area, you also have that angular plane limitation in as much as part of that site is in the rapid transit corridor place type, parts in neighborhoods, but in terms of if you were to consolidate those properties, it could all be considered in rapid transit corridor, and that's how you could achieve some higher heights in that area, up to sort of 16 stories in the middle. In the west, sort of having 2 to 4 stories on the lands that really have St. Peter's Basilica Cathedral, with heights transitioning down as you go north, but then there is the limitation in terms of the shadow on the concrete pad. So then this is a demonstration plan of what this development could potentially look like. You'll see here we've got the angular planes, sort of they're almost the sheets of glass that you see, and then also it's factored in the shadow criteria too. So you can see here that these are the existing heights. They really vary between the 1989 official plan, the London plan, and the zoning bylaw, but generally we're actually seeing kind of an increase from, in many cases, what is permitted here. So we've also got several design features, including step backs, setbacks, limiting floor plate sizes, the location of parking, really to make sure that everything that's built is well designed and helps to complement the park. Those are generally unchanged. There's some changes since the draft plan, but very similar. In terms of land use, we continue to have that requirement for retail on Richmond Street, but they're surrounding the rest of the park based on the feedback we heard, previously we were encouraging retail. Now we recognize that office, residential, all those land uses are also quite good. And we have limited the size of residential lobbies. We also have compatibility with park activities, the requirements for the wind and noise studies. Those are also relatively unchanged, except we now require wind studies at the zoning stage also, in response to feedback we've heard that there's a lot of concern about wind. We also have added a requirement for sustainable development, so looking at having green roofs, encouraging sustainable design practices for new buildings, encouraging the provision of covered bicycle parking in response to the climate emergency. We've also put in an Our Tools section to really help us implement all these policies, outlining what's required for site plan and zoning bylaw amendment applications. So then we're also recommending to amend the policies for the Woodfield neighborhood. These are both in the 1989 official plan and the London plan. So essentially we'd be adding something, language such that if there's any inconsistency with these policies with the Victoria Park secondary plan, the Victoria Park secondary plan would prevail because Victoria Park secondary plan forms a small portion of that area. Similarly, we are also recommending the North Block be evaluated for designation. You'll see here, so these properties are all, or almost all, listed on the city's Register of Cultural Heritage Resources. And so just having that closer look, and that will also help to add some additional clarity about what those resources are. In the application of the plan. So we're recommending to adopt the Victoria Park secondary plan under both the 1989 official plan and the London plan, and amend those Woodfield neighborhood-specific policies, and also be directed to evaluate the properties in the North Block for heritage designation. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Committee, I might hold off on technical questions and go, we have at least one delegation, so you can have a seat. Ms. Canarium, thank you so much for that. I'll go first to Mr. Stapleton, who's here with a presentation of his own, I do believe.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, members of committee. Thank you for the opportunity to come back again and speak to you about the Victoria Park secondary plan. After a year and a half of process, unfortunately, there still remains some issues that are yet to be resolved as part of this process. Fundamentally, they deal with how to determine appropriate height around the park. What we need to understand, or how we go about understanding or determining what's appropriate height, there's an evolution process that we go through. We have to understand the evolution of the core, what transitional cues exist. Is this neighborhood a stable neighborhood, or is it a transitional neighborhood? These locational attributes, are they in proximity to support intensification? These are things like open space, employment, retail, things of that nature. But we also have to understand what are the impacts of having this intensification in this process, and this dialogue continues today. The first aspect, if I could just take a couple of seconds, I'm going to be around 5 minutes, I timed myself, so I should be okay, is the historical evolution of the area. And it's quite interesting, the evolution of Victoria Park and our quadrant, I'll call it, which is the East Policy area. They developed separate from Woodfield. They evolved later than Woodfield. However, at one point in time, they did have an urban fabric similar with single-family homes along the east side of the Wellington corridor. You'll notice this in these photographs. The original block south of, or north of Dufferin, all the way to almost Pall Mall, was the military barracks or garrison. This shows you approximately the location of our property at 560, 562 Wellington Street in that configuration. These photos show the evolution of the Wellington corridor. That should say prior to year 1972 at the top, not, that's the historical single detached residential lot fabric that existed on Wellington. It was replaced in the 1960s, early 70s with the conversion of this corridor to employment, institutional, residential, and office uses that stretch from Wellington and extend to our property on the south side of Wolf Street at 560, 562 Wellington. Determining appropriate height. So when we look at this, spoke about locational attributes, you know, intensification close to employment, open space, entertainment, retail, having the infrastructure to accommodate that, have a policy framework that supports that, a transit proximity also assists in dictating to intensification. But the question remains, how high and where? So determining height, we have to do an assessment and a characterization of the area. That means determining whether or not the area is significantly impacted by height. And you do that through analysis of the area. Is it a stable area? Is this a single-family residential area where rear yard amenity space is being used for private uses? Is it transitional, meaning is there conversions? Is it existing houses being utilized for multifamily office and those rear yard amenity areas being converted for parking spaces? These are the types of cues that represent whether or not you have a stable area or a transitional neighborhood. That depends, and those cues will tell you how sensitive you have to be to determine height. So what are the sensitivities? Well, obviously sensitivities for someone's rear yard with a pool and private amenity space is more significant than someone's parking area. And in fact, in our block, we have those cues taking place. So this is south of Wolf Street, looking from our office building down into the internal neighborhood that's in the rear of our property. It is designated neighborhood currently. It is under appeal. However, you do have an 8-story apartment building and more internal to the Woodfield community. You'll notice the numerous parking spots in all the photographs. There's a number of multifamily and office uses within this block. These cues and these reasons, because you're on the periphery of downtown, you'll see these transitional natures all around downtown and on the periphery of downtown. It really informs planners that these areas are under stress, they're under pressures due to the locational attributes to suggest a change in land use. So that's what's happening, and it's been happening around Victoria Park for some time. This is the transitional multifamily units. This is a city document that came from City Hall, shows the licensees on Wolf Street, shows you, it also informs you of the transitional nature that I specified earlier. The existing zoning also informs land use in the area. There's a number of properties with existing zoning ranging from 22 stories to 30 stories on the east side of
You have about 30 seconds left.
Oh, sorry. So I'll speed up. Everyone knows that story. Also, this area is already developed once. Like I said, in the 70s, it was reconverted, and those changes did not affect Woodfield either. Compatibility of being built form. Built form doesn't equate to compatibility. Again, I point you back to the issue of characterization and transitional nature of the area. The issue with height, you'll notice in the secondary plan, the north policy area, it identifies a 16-story limit, which is an internalized building within the north policy area. We're seeking a similar height on our block as well, 16 stories.
And you're over your 5 minutes right now.
I have one thing that I should show the committee. I also say that obviously the public process was quite thorough, and there was a number of people that spoke in favor of development, not just of our site, but the east side of Wellington. So I raised that point as well. So in summary, and in the last planning committee I was at, there was a mention of virtual reality renderings of the area. How does it feel? We did this before we saw the secondary plan last Thursday. So we went with the the heights that were prescribed in the draft document. 25, City Hall sites 25, 22. The London Life building that you'll see is as the current application is at 18 stories. And then our property is shown at 15 stories, which we did share with staff some time ago. So
Okay.
if we could just show it, it's less than a minute. It's less than a minute. So this is Dufferin Street, driving down Dufferin Street. You get in your flying car, you turn left. These are the buildings. We just articulated certain buildings there. Not sure if they're going to be residential or not. This is from Clarence Street, looking across the park, showing the bandshell and the east streetscape of Wellington Street. So it gives you an idea of how it frames the park and things of that nature. This is on Wellington Street, of course, in front of our proposal. The London Life building next to us, and walking through the park. So I think we hit the points that some members of the committee or council were at the last meeting.
Okay,
To
I'm
illustrate
going to have
that,
to
so
stop you there.
we're done.
A lot of leeway. Thank
Thank
you.
you very much.
Thank you for your presentation,
Yeah.
Mr. Stapleton.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay, so we have another presentation. You can come forward to the podium, and we'll see your presentation. And if you'll state your name, I'll wait until he gets your thing up on the screen so that we don't start your time too soon, because I know sometimes these technical things take time. And you can give us your name, and once your presentation starts, I'll give you 5 minutes.
Okay, so my name is Hazel Elmsley, and I live at 63 Arcadia Crescent, although I lived in the Woodfield neighborhood from 1973 to 2016. And I'm here to talk about impact and how does it feel. And I don't agree with Mr. Stapleton. But I do not have really big issues with the draft plan as it's been amended. I believe that street engagement, all the things that they're talking about, street engagement, wind, shadowing, parking, understanding that there's quicksand all around here, so I don't know how much underground parking they're going to be able to do. Setbacks and greening put into the redevelopment are all very, very positive things of this draft plan. And I would like the council to make this so tight when you finally pass it, that LPAT will not be able to overturn any portion of it. That is so important. Outsiders making decisions for Londoners, that's not fair. So to talk to Mr. Stapleton in the public amenity space, I would remind him that his wind tunnel study of the 30 stories that was proposed for his property was unsafe in the winter, all winter, and the recommendation from the wind study people was to have the doors locked. So that is why I am so concerned about wind in the park. However, now we're going to look at impact on another building that is going not too far from the park. So this is on Dufferin Ave, looking east. You can see the Basilica there. And then you can see this new building that's hardly started. It's going to be 31 stories, I think. And then we go to the other side of the Basilica, and that's what we see. And then we go to the corner of Angel Street with the church, the Baptist church backing me, and this is what you see. And we cross the street and we look down Richmond Street, and this is what you see. These pictures were taken this morning, so the sun wasn't in my favor. And the last picture is looking across the park from the driveway at Centennial Hall. The tower of the Basilica is right here, but this is what, you're going to see it up here. It's going to be up here. And then last of all, we're looking from the Reg Cooper Square steps towards London Life. Of course, that's One London Place, and 35 stories can go back in here. That's what we're going to see. So how does that impact make you feel, folks? That's all I'm asking. How does it make you feel? Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Elmsley. So we have another presentation, I believe. Mr. Paul is here, and if you want to come to the podium.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, for the opportunity to speak. My name is William Pohl, and I was retained through the Urban 360 Lab at Fanshawe College to assist the Friends of Victoria Park. The principle that we'd like to bring forward as Friends of Victoria Park are a vibrant, diverse, and healthy neighborhood that creates a sense of place and character. This is taken as an excerpt from the London Plan 193.9. This is what we're trying to achieve. And these principles include retaining the existing landscape, the topographical features, and integrating things like Victoria Park into the neighborhood. Proposals that articulate the neighborhood's character, demonstrate how it fits into that neighborhood context. Designed to enhance and ensure that the historical context is conserved into that sense of place, being Victoria Park. And finally, street patterns that encourage active transportation, cycling and walking in support of a transit service. That's what the Friends of Victoria Park are interested in creating. As part of our background work on behalf of the Friends of Victoria Park, we prepared these renderings. The building in the brown, this is a view from City Hall, looking across to the west through Victoria Park. This was done in August of 2019, so these are the assumptions that we were using at the time. The brown building is under construction now, and the proposed ones would be shown in yellow. This is the view from the band shell towards St. Peter's Basilica and Richmond Street. The view northerly towards across Central Avenue, Richmond Street being on the left. The view from Victoria Park across the Boer Memorial to the potential development adjacent to the now Canada Life buildings. And finally, conceptually looking north along Wellington Street, adjacent to Centennial Hall and just south of Wolfe Street. From my review of the material, 30-story tall buildings are going to have impact on the sunlight, wind, and rain patterns. And before the city proceeds, as you may have heard earlier today, we really need to understand the impacts, the physical impacts on the environment. We think that a Victoria Park neighborhood should consider low and mid-rise apartments to create a neighborhood where we can create that sense of place. Generally, in reviewing the central London area, mid and low-rise apartments are few and far between. And that in fact, high-rise development should be directed to vacant parking lots in the downtown core. Mid-rise would be examples on Huron Street, Proudfoot Lane, Fanshawe Park Road East. We have many examples of what could be developed in a mid-rise form of residential. As part of our background work, we also partnered with other community members to look at the potential development of parking lots in the core area. The concepts in gray show existing and approved sites. The concepts in browns are opportunity sites for parking lot redevelopment. Based on a conservative estimate, approximately 2,400 new units could be developed in the downtown without the need to develop in a Victoria Park neighborhood. If we look towards bonusing, that could be several times that amount, larger buildings with public amenity. And finally, active transportation, public transit. Although this is a design exercise, we do need to consider policies for cycling in addition to pedestrian access. There is very little consideration of public transit. And on the opposite side of that, potentially reducing the amount of parking to encourage other forms of transit.
You have about 30 seconds left.
In terms of height principles, an excerpt from Yan Gel's book on Cities for People. At about 5 stories, we have a connection to the core area. We've seen these photographs. Recommended heights, angular plane of 45 degrees, neighborhood place type 2 to 4, downtown place type 2 to 8, rapid transit corridor 2 to 12. In conclusions, we are supporting a Victoria Park neighborhood based on a scale that is mid-rise and supports a sense of place. Our recommendation is that the Victoria Park secondary plan be reconsidered by staff for 3 matters: impact on the natural environment, policies regarding heights be revised, and include policies on active transportation. Thank you very much for your time, Madam Chair and committee members. I'm available for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Paul. Are there any other presentations to be seen on screen? No. Okay, so any members of the public that would like to comment? We have 4 microphones, 1, 2, 3, and 4. Make your way to the microphone, give us your name, and you'll have 5 minutes. We got some, there we go, go
Hello.
ahead.
Hi, my name is Daniel Walker, and I live at 570 Wellington, and I'm one of those dinosaurs, single-family home, no rear parking. It's definitely a backyard. I just wanted to go on record for that, 570 Wellington.
Thank you, Ms. Walker. Go ahead up there, and then we'll come back down here.
Thank you. I'm Jennifer Granger. I'm president of ACO London. And to begin with, I'd like to say on behalf of ACO that we definitely appreciate the city's efforts to try and balance the intensification with the cultural heritage resources around the park. I'm especially delighted to hear about the possibility of designating the buildings on the north side. However, we do have a few concerns. Further to Ms. Elmsley's comments that we heard earlier, immediately north of St. Peter's Cathedral, heights of up to 30 stories may be permitted, transitioning down to 25 stories further north of St. Peter's. That sounds very high for that particular spot. And there's been much consideration of view corridors, but I would like to express some concern of what the view of the cathedral is going to look like if you're standing to the south of it and you're looking towards the north. I just wonder what that particular view will look like once there's something that's 30 stories there. Now, we have heard that the Victoria Park secondary plan will trump the HCD, the West Woodfield HCD. I'm not clear exactly on how that works, but it seems to be that not enough attention is being paid to the Heritage Conservation District of West Woodfield and its guidelines. If we do have tall buildings within the HCD, it seems like that sets a precedent for high rises in other HCDs around the city. I'm not sure that that's the direction that most of us want to go in. There are many suitable development sites on the southern edge of downtown, and ACO has mentioned this many times. that it seems as though, according to planning department, 19 or 20% of downtown is actually surface parking lots. And I think that that is where the city should be encouraging developers to put their high rises rather than surrounding the park. And I realize that the city can't necessarily tell developers this is what they're going to do, but it would be appreciated if there was some way to encourage them to actually do this. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Granger. First, I'll go to this microphone down here. Is there anybody down at the lower level here who would like to speak?
Sure. I'll go again. My name is Kate Rapps, and I'm speaking on behalf of the Woodfield Community Association. Thank you to the Planning Department and to Michelle and all those involved for drafting this, and members of PEC for listening to the plan and as well as the comments. It's certainly a difficult thing to balance, as Jennifer mentioned, intensification with preserving the park and also preserving the Woodfield community. There's lots of varying opinions in our community on the impact of high rises and what they might mean to Victoria Park. Some will say build lots of buildings and build them as high as you can, and others will say build high but maybe in the right location. At our last AGM, we discussed the Victoria Park secondary plan at length, and attendance there was about 70 people. There was an overwhelming majority agreed that this high of intensification scenario, and just to remind you that last spring, the planning department at one of the public meetings showed 3 scenarios, low, mid, and high intensification around the park. The secondary plan that's being proposed today looks like they opted for the high intensification around the park. So the people at the AGM felt that that level of intensification around the park would be detrimental to the park itself. If it's our crown jewel, we feel we should protect it and respect it and not sell it to developers. Specifically, our concerns lie with the height of the building along the west side and east sides areas of the park. These are 30-story buildings. No matter how they're designed, they would impact the small urban park. We also agree with Jennifer at the ACO as well that the current draft disregards to a large part the West Woodfield Heritage Conservation District guidelines, which state that new buildings in the area should be low to mid-rise. So in conclusion, we would like to ask that the Planning Committee refer this draft back to planning. Sorry, that PEC refer this back to planning and look for ways to balance the city's intensification goals with the health and access to the Victoria Park, as well as to examine how low to mid-rise developments would meet intensification goals, whatever they are. And finally, we'd like to ask the planning to hire a consultant to study the environmental impact of this current plan. If all the buildings were constructed, what would the impact be on the park in terms of the environment with wind, shadowing, heat wells, and so forth. Also, traffic should be considered as well. Wellington, just a reminder, is a dead-end street. While the draft requires that new development applications include wind and shadow studies, they will not look at the park as a whole. We need that information to make sure what we are doing in the years ahead is best to preserve the park as a vibrant green space in the heart of the city. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Okay, I'll go over here.
Thank you. It's Mary Ann Hodge. I'm a resident in Woodfield. I am deeply disappointed in the secondary plan. I recognize that compromises must be made, but as the plan states, Victoria Park is a jewel and a location of civic importance. With this secondary plan, I fear we are selling off this jewel for private consumption instead of public service. The West Woodfield Heritage Conservation Plan was created to preserve this cultural heritage. As the secondary plan agrees that 4 to 5 stories is the predominant height around the park, you would think the secondary plan would support the heritage plan. Instead, the secondary plan advocates for the construction of some of the tallest buildings in London. I do support the height of development at Wolfe and Wellington Streets, the approval of ground floor occupancies other than retail, the requirements for public site plan review and wind and shadow studies, the addition of rear and side yard setbacks, and the setback for the southeast corner development at Wolfe Street. Although I would request there be stronger language that would clarify that the alignment is with the predominant building face and not the front edge of the porches. But these compromises do not address the number one issue that many of us have, and that is the overall height of 6 to 7 high-rise buildings circling the park, many of which are proposed at 30 to 35 stories high. And there are 5 details I wish to highlight. 1, the secondary plan was revised to address the concern over the impacts of increased intensification on the wear and tear of the park grounds. The plan includes a requirement to, quote, provide on-site indoor and/or outdoor amenity space. I propose we remove the "or", as allowing the amenity space to be indoor only does not relieve the pressure on the use of the park, especially due to anticipated increased dog populations. Number 2, the 45-degree angle rule that was added to the revised secondary plan speaks to the concern for high-rise development next to low density, which is great. If we have the same concern for the natural heritage of the park as we do for the residents in the low-density neighborhoods, then the park should get the same consideration. If you draft a 45-degree line from the 10.5-meter elevation above the park, I believe the maximum height of development around the park would be around 20 stories. Now, I don't advocate for 20 stories, but it is better than 30 to 35. Number 3, the plan says it strives to gradually reduce the building heights along Wellington Street, but allowing a 30-story building to sit next to an 8-story building does not seem gradual to me. Number 4, I challenge you to think about a future for City Hall that embraces the idea of a civic square along Wellington Street. City Hall is 12 stories, and I do not think any building along this side of the park should be taller than City Hall. Number 5, parking has also been a source of concern. It sounds to me that the plan is saying, we would prefer parking to be underground, but realize that this probably won't happen, so as long as we can't see it from the street, then above ground is okay. The secondary plan notes that parking underground is, quote, encouraged. Without the will or the shall language, this request has little weight. If parking is allowed above grade, then this should be offset by providing infrastructure and supports to facilitate shared vehicle usage, such as car share services, like the new Sifton development at West 5. As you know, I'm a strong advocate for action on the climate emergency, and the secondary plan makes a point of commenting on how building 30-story towers helps with the climate emergency. Intensification does make it easier to participate in public transit and active transportation options. However, the reality is often that residents of buildings such as this continue to drive wherever they need to go, as public transit is chronically underfunded in London. The secondary plan was revised to include a provision to, quote, encourage covered, secure bicycle parking. I would like this wording strengthened to read, will provide covered storage facilities for securing bicycles for 15% or more of building occupants. And intensification does not mean density at all costs. Even 5 stories is increased density. We need to protect the green islands we have in our concrete jungle. I therefore request that PEC send this report back to staff to rethink the heights for all proposed development around the park and incorporate active transportation initiatives that are more than just encouragements. Thank you.
Thank you. I just want to remind the gallery that you will have opposing viewpoints in here, so we ask that you not clap or boo or cheer, just so that everybody's point of view is respected and nobody feels intimidated from coming to the microphone. So we'll go up to the top there.
Yeah, thank you. This doesn't count as my time.
I'm not quite sure.
Okay. Oh, good. Okay, thank you. My name is Anna Maria Velasco. I live on the west side of the park. There are maybe 4, maybe 6 developers that dominate new development in this city. They have the wealth to accumulate land and shape this city in their own image. And many people are growing, there's growing cynicism that the voices of residents that actually live in these areas is not being heard. When I look around at Victoria Park, I don't see one single building that is worthy of demolition. There is nothing wrong with the park as it currently stands, but we have a few very ambitious developers who invested in land acquisition, and now they want a big return on their money. At the very first public meeting on this issue, a city planner stated that it was important to ensure investors get a return for their investment, such as then London Life, who purchased Centennial Hall in the 1960s. The same consideration wasn't afforded to the residents at 155 Kent Street, whose condo value seems to have plummeted when the city awarded Old Oaks Property the license to build a tower meters away from someone's private residence, blocking their view and sunshine. This is about wealthy individuals elbowing and bullying for views of Victoria Park as a selling feature for prospective buyers at the expense of local residents. Please don't box in the park. There is not one single building that is worthy of demolition around that park. And in the future, any new development should maintain the current height of the building removed, if it has to be removed. This whole idea that if we don't grow, we die is a falsehood. If we grow without the checks and balances and without maintaining livable space, we certainly will die. There are currently many options of open spaces to build in the downtown. I personally don't care how rich someone is. They do not have greater rights than someone that is not wealthy, but actually lives in these communities. I'm asking that the height limit around Victoria Park be lowered to maintain its current status, so not to block sunshine and give local residents a sense of open space, something that is quickly disappearing in the downtown. Tearing down buildings just for the sake of because you want to invest in a new building puts immense pressure on landfills, the natural environment, the resources that are going into building a new building when the one that is there is perfect. The developers should be encouraged to repurpose buildings, not tear them down and put up something that will overshadow and dominate the residents. So I'm asking that PAC reject the secondary plan and go back and revisit the heights surrounding the park. Thank you.
Thank you. Go ahead, sir.
Hello. Hello. My name is Bob Morrison. I live in Wellington Street North, in Old North. I'm encouraged that the climate change considerations have been integrated into the Victoria Park secondary plan. We need to make sure all our decisions going forward take that into account. One part of the response to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions is the intensification of the city. In particular, intensification should occur along transit corridors in the downtown and the surrounding area. However, we should not simply allow maximum intensification or maximum heights at the expense of creating an enjoyable and livable space for all. I commend staff for integrating into the secondary plan the principles of encouraging active transportation and preserving, strengthening, and creating new view corridors. Focusing on public places and placemaking is critical to the long-term success of intensification efforts in the city. As a result, the Victoria Park secondary plan is critical not just for the properties immediately adjacent to it, but all the properties within easy walk from it. The concept of inner and outer park is extremely relevant to Victoria Park given its relatively small size. The built area surrounding the park should be treated like the outer park. Victoria Park needs to be easy to get to and easily accessible by foot. Surrounding streets should promote walking and cycling. Nearby traffic lights should be timed for pedestrians, not vehicles. Dufferin Street and Wellington Street are occasionally already closed to car traffic for events in Victoria Park. I would recommend that without exception, new development in the secondary plan boundary should not allow parking access off of Dufferin, Clarence, or Wellington. There seems to be some leeway allowing that currently in the plan. In fact, future consideration should be made to allowing these streets to be flex streets that would be closed to car traffic on a regular basis. Flex street design would allow pop-up amenities and would help manage the additional anticipated intensive use of the park. Accessibility and use of great public places is greatly affected by the buildings that surround it. Elements within Victoria Park should be visible from a distance, and ground floor activity of the buildings and building heights should entice pedestrians to move towards the park. Victoria Park, masked and surrounded by 30-story buildings, is not open, nor is it welcoming to draw people in from nearby streets. Having a mix of low, medium, and high-rise is important. Angular planes in design is somewhat helpful. However, given the size of Victoria Park, I believe a maximum of a 12-story building consistent with City Hall would be more appropriate and enticing. As the city moves towards meeting the vision as set out by the London Plan, the strategic plan, and its response to the climate emergency, maintaining and enhancing key public places will be key to the long-term success of the overall intensification effort. Let's keep Victoria Park a jewel for all Londoners. Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else? Go ahead. State your name, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Greg Priamo from Zelenka Priamo Limited. I'm representing Great West Life Realty Services, which is the residential subsidiary of Canada Life. They own 2 properties in the study area, both at Dufferin and Clarence and at Wellington and Wolfe. We're in a unique situation because we have a piece of property within the study area that we initiated excuse me, development approvals on prior to the initiation of the area plan. And we brought forward a site plan application that was nicely previewed by Mr. Stapleton's presentation. And we expect it to be coming through to Planning Committee later this winter, early spring. So we've been following the Victoria Park plan carefully because it has implications for not only what we're doing right now, but also we wanted to ensure that we were having regard for what options and opportunities for development the park plan could provide. The park plan as it is currently contemplated would have material impact on the approvability of the site plan application that we currently have before staff. The application does not require any amendments to the zoning bylaw. It's 100% in compliance, and it's represented by an 18-story terraced building that largely fronts on Wellington Road. We have had the opportunity, and we have appreciated the opportunity to discuss the park plan with staff from the very beginning of the process through to very recently. And we appreciate the efforts that staff have made to respond to some of the concerns, or as many of the concerns raised through the public process as possible. However, that being said, in its current form, our client would continue to have reservations about whether or not it will deliver the best outcome. And in particular, there are a number of regulatory tools that have been inserted in the plan since the last draft was brought forward, which we've only had since Wednesday of last week, and we haven't had the opportunity to fully explore the implications for what that might mean for development on both the lands currently owned by Canada Life. That being said, as a number of the speakers have addressed, this is a very complicated process with a lot of varying interests. And should the committee decide to refer this matter back, we would continue to engage with staff and provide our input and try to affect an outcome that's consistent with the objectives of the park plan, but also recognizes our objectives on our clients' lands equally as best we can. In the event that it goes forward in its current form, it's a document that our client would oppose for the reasons I've identified. Certainly happy to answer any questions that the committee might have.
Thank you. Mr. Priamo, down at this microphone, go ahead.
Thank you. My name is Kelly McKeating, and I live at 329 Victoria Street. Some of my comments are going to repeat comments made by others, and some other of my comments we haven't heard yet. Firstly, I would like to observe that the material in your agenda package related to this item covered about 250 pages, and that's a lot of material for the public to digest, react to in less than a week. And certainly my comments would be more thoughtful and more extensive if we'd been given time. And when I hear that the Great West Life representative has had a number of conversations with planning staff on this subject, it makes me feel that there's a bit of an uneven playing field here, and I just want to make that observation. It is disappointing and surprising to me that this secondary plan does appear to override the HCD plan that's already in place. I didn't think that that was allowed, and I'm, again, surprised at it. With regards to some of Mr. Stapleton's remarks, I do want to point out that Wolf Street and Central Ave, behind 560, 562 Wellington, there are no driveways. Parking to those buildings, no matter who's living in them or whether they're used for offices, it's laneway parking, and I've been behind those houses, and in addition to the laneway parking, there are backyards that people enjoy and sit in and use, and they would be impacted by shadow. In addition, the Woodfield Heritage Conservation District isn't that particularly diverse in terms of height. Other than that 8-story apartment building, I don't think there's anything else particularly high. The glazing requirements in the recommendations talk about glazing over 70% of the building, but there's no requirement for that to be spread over the building. So one can picture a situation where you've got above ground parking and 30% of the building at the very bottom is totally black, and then the glazing is above it, subject to structural constraints, which I don't understand because I'm not an engineer. So I'd just like to suggest that the glazing requirements include some requirement that that be spread over the building. With respect to distance between towers, right now, the proposed requirement is 11 meters for mid-rise buildings, 25 meters for high-rise buildings. I think it should be 25 meters for all buildings. I think that people who live in a mid-rise building deserve just as much privacy, just as much view as those who live in a taller building. The tower plate square footage limit, right now, it is a larger limit for the mid-rise buildings over the high-rise. I think it should be the same, and I think that the high-rise square footage limit for the tower plates should apply to everybody. With regards to the protection of views, there is, the thoughtful consideration of view corridors in the recommendations is, appreciated and very positive. But I was surprised and disappointed to see that there's no discussion of silhouette views, particularly in contrast to the city of Toronto, where they have pages and pages and pages of their official plan deal with this. And as one example of that, they say, no building will interrupt or rise above the silhouette of the Ontario Legislature building at Queen's Park when viewed from University Avenue, subject to a view corridor analysis completed to the satisfaction of the city. And I would have liked to have seen, in particular for St. Peter's Basilica, a similar requirement, but instead, the proposal is that the tallest buildings around the park at 30 stories could be directly behind the basilica. And I think that's unfortunate and perhaps not as well thought through as it should be. Other cities, and like the other London, they do have skyscrapers. All cities can and should have skyscrapers. But most cities don't put them adjacent to their landmark buildings. And to have a skyscraper adjacent to St. Peter's, I don't think is a very good idea. I was trying to be very balanced when I was reviewing this and preparing my comments. So I certainly, the permitted heights that I thought of were in North A and West B 8 stories, in West C 12 stories, in South A 15 stories, and in East D and E 20 stories, but I'd love the limits to be even lower than those. The required base...
so you're past 5 minutes,
okay,
if you could
sorry.
wrap it up.
I will wrap up. Required base, I think it should be 2 to 3 stories on all buildings, and I think that the angular planes should be on a different angle to protect people's views and sunshine. Thank you very much. Sorry for being over time.
Thank you so much. And we could send somebody up to get your notes if you would like your written notes included in the record.
I emailed them earlier today.
Wonderful, thanks very much. Go ahead, sir, your name, and then you'll have 5 minutes.
Okay. My name's Casey Golchicki. I'm a planner with Zelenka Prama Limited. I'm here tonight representing the Roman Catholic Diocese of London and their property at St. Peter's Basilica. We provided some late correspondence this morning to Planning Committee, and we're not sure if that got into your package or not, but I'm just going to quickly kind of just go over what was in that package. We had provided some correspondence to city staff on the previous drafts of the secondary document, and we are a little disappointed that a lot of our concerns that we raised with staff were not addressed in the latest draft, and the implications of the potential development on our property. Furthermore, new policies have come to light in this draft that would have further implications on the property, and we haven't had the opportunity to fully address those and what those implications are. So we would like to see a deferral back to staff in order for us to fully explore those implications and then to also continue the dialogue with staff on the previous concerns that we have raised. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Go ahead.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, councillors. My name is Mike Wallace. I'm the Executive Director of the London Development Institute, as you know, and my office is within this planning area at 562 Wellington Street. I'm not here about my office. As you can see, this is actually what the report looks like. We got it on Thursday. I had the pleasure of being with you folks Thursday and Friday for your budget meetings. Looking forward to the rest of the week. The fact is that we also would like, as an organization, this referred back to staff. We have not, as a group, had an opportunity to look at this final draft that's going to staff. It's not necessarily just about the Victoria Park secondary plan, but what the implications might be for other secondary plans throughout the city that do affect our organization and the landowners that belong to the LDI. So we have an opportunity as a group to be reviewing this over the next week or two, which we would be happy to provide you comments on what we think about this and what its implications might be for other secondary plans as they come forward, whether they are around other areas within the community that you're hoping to see some redevelopment and development. So we're asking you to send it back, not pass it tonight, and give us a chance to give you proper response. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And just I want to say, anybody that has written notes that has already spoken or who will speak at some point, if you have not sent your comments in, we can take those comments and include them. So just if you have something written down and you want us to include it in the record, exactly how it's written, we can do that. So I'll go over here to see if there is anybody else that would like to comment. We have 2 microphones on this side. Not seeing anybody jumping up. Over here. Come to the microphone, state your name, go ahead.
Hello, my name is Janet Hunton, 253 Huron Street. I want to suggest an alternative way of approaching the heights that might be termed an averaging. If one building is select a height, don't ask me how, something in the mid-range. And if one building is taller, another one must be shorter. This is what I mean by an averaging. And this is the way we appreciate what we look at. Not one tall building, not so bad, 20, not so good. So I offer that suggestion.
Thank you very much. Go ahead, sir, your name, and then you have 5 minutes.
And I reside at 298 Wolf Street. Just like to, just a personal observation. Mr. Stapleton spoke, about is 16 stories or whatever. Well, I'm directly impacted by that. I have a balcony at the back of my apartment, which would be submerged in shadow much, much earlier in the day. The grass that we have growing in the backyard would be dead, as the trees are now because of the amount of vehicles that occupy the laneway. I'm in a transitional property. In 1982, I transitioned into 296, and I've now transitioned into 298, all the while improving the property to its historical standard. Okay? And if there's all this development going on, let me tell you, I'm going to have a videographer in, because the city and the people who do the development are going to pay the price. Because even when the trucks go by, they can damage the structure quite easily. It's 1892. It's still there. I'd like to see it there for another 100 years for people to enjoy. Victoria Park is the gem of our city. It's like a diamond, but it's not in the rough. And hopefully we don't cover it with coal, okay, by blackening it out with all these huge buildings around it. Council here has an opportunity to protect, okay, ongoing for generations to come, that beautiful little park. It is not Central Park in New York. It is not acres and acres. It's a postage stamp. And you want to drown it by putting all this shadow and darkness around it? I just don't think it's real. I hope that this council can make the appropriate decision, because since I've been here, this city, not your fault, but downtown was gorgeous, and they turned it into a mausoleum of derelict buildings and neon and people just hanging out. It was thriving. No more. Please make the right decision on Victoria Park. It's a gem. Don't turn it into coal.
Thank you, sir. Any other comments? Mr. Brown?
Thank you. I'm not going to comment on the height of the buildings or whatsoever. But I guess one thing I'd like to say is, we seem to be failing on, as a city in general, of that interaction between the sidewalk and the pedestrian and the building itself. Like, I find that the critical thing that we have to look at in design. If the first 3 stories of your building is parking, guess what? I don't want to be next to it. I don't care how high it is. There's nothing there. It's also going to be dangerous for pedestrians coming in and out of the entrance. I haven't seen a single entranceway downtown where that's not the case. We're just not there. We haven't figured it out yet. Other cities have. Maybe we should look to there. But the other thing I wanted to comment on is it has not come up. And it has been, it is a focus of your budget discussions and your 5-year plans. I know this is a design and an area plan, but nobody's talked about affordability of the core. Not a one word, not a single word. If this is what's important to us, we need to be talking about it. Like, we have proposals for buildings downtown, and I know that our legs got cut out from under us with the recent changes to the PPS, and I understand that, but I'm not restricted by PPS for my comments, so it really doesn't matter. But is it not important that the core remain affordable to everybody? When I live in a building, and in the last 5 years, the rents have doubled, literally doubled. I haven't got twice as much space to live in. So the affordability of our city is going down and down and down. And I think I don't know if we even have the tools to do it anymore. I mean, I know I feel for you because I know how most of you would really feel about it too. But do we not at least have the conversation about the affordability of our core, buildings for families, buildings that are affordable for families, and a place to live, not just for the rich. Anyhow, thank you.
Thank you. Go ahead, sir.
I'm Marcus Coles from 38 Palace Street. What seems to be missed, and I agree with a lot of the comments here, but when we've got these buildings with all these residential units in, we're going to have a lot more traffic down these streets. It stands to reason. And those buildings have to feed off these streets, with access to their parking above ground, below ground, or whatever. And that doesn't seem to be addressed. And these streets are going to end up as not wide enough. You know, you're going to run into transit problems with conflicts. And I don't think this has really been fully addressed. Another thing is just the servicing of the buildings. I don't know how much sewer capacity is around Victoria Park, but if you're putting up big buildings, you got to service them. And I don't know if the city's development funds are going to cover that or what, but it seems to be sort of sliding below the radar too. Anyway, thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you, sir. Okay, we have somebody here. So we'll go down here first and then on the upper mic next. Go ahead.
My name's Rebecca Francolini, and I live at 38 Palace Street, or 52 Palace Street. What a memory. Now I know my neighbor. So I grew up in Woodfield. I went to Bishop Cronin, I went to Lord Roberts, and I went to Central. And I've moved back there. My kids went to Beale. I really love my neighborhood. But unlike what feels like everybody in this room, I really want the development. I want more people downtown. I want more people in our core. And I think that if we build these buildings with families in mind, like my neighbor said, and talk about affordability and getting families into the core, I am so for this. I mean, I would love to walk from my home and know that I had part of what was happening in my neighborhood. I mean, as we look around Woodfield, we see all of these buildings that we're probably not given a welcome mat. I mean, we all know them. We look at them and we go, oh, what is that? But it's now part of our neighborhood and we embrace it just the same. So couldn't we possibly come together as a community and decide that more people in our community, welcome them, welcome the new people to our community, the youth that want to live in the core, and come up with a solution that would be artistic, embrace architectural features that are in our neighborhood now. So don't have 3 stories of a glass wall of an apartment building, a parking complex. I don't want that either. Couldn't we possibly incorporate some of the Gothic columns that we see in our neighborhood? I think there are other ways than just saying no.
Thank you. Up here at the top.
My name is Daphne Allen, and I live at 520 Wellington, and I love the view from my balcony of Victoria Park. The sunset, the lights, the skaters, everybody should have a view like that. I think maybe I have 2 questions. Number 1, how many 30-story buildings are there in the downtown core of London right now?
So what we do is we take the comments and questions and we let everybody have their turn, and then whatever comments have come up, then staff address them all at once.
It's the first time I've ever been here, probably the last.
You're doing great.
All the council people turn to, you probably have it open to 33. I'm not sure if it's 209 or 33. It's the page that has the permitted heights, okay? So my question was, how many 30-story buildings are there in downtown core London? Because I'm just new here again after many years. Okay. There's building 1 across that it's fascinating to watch every day. Okay. So my question is, did anybody say how many there were downtown?
No, we will get you that. We'll get you that answer at the end.
However many there are.
Yeah.
Why would the planners, I know you've done a fantastic job on this, on other areas. The only one I complain about is the heights. Okay. So I think 10, 12 maximum.
Thank you. Any other comments? Anybody else wish to speak? one more time. Is there anybody else in the gallery that would, go ahead.
Hi, my name is Michael Catrice. I'm a resident of 92 Kent Street, party to the official plan. I can see what's happening with the City of London and the growth and the trajectory of what's happening in the future. There's an opportunity, and I think you guys are grabbing the bull by the horns to really take advantage of the potential of what's going to come in the future. London is known as an industrial city. It's been around for 200 years. I've had an opportunity to really take an organic look at where we came from and where we are now. And what seems to be missing is the opportunity for the families, for the seniors, for the new people coming into the city to really root themselves, not just in a location to live, but also opportunity to work. Being the industrial city that we came from, I'm just curious, with all of these buildings that are going around the downtown core, is it inviting for a lot of new industry to come in? I know one of the buildings is going to be London Life, going to bring a lot of jobs into the downtown core, which is an opportunity for the new people coming into the city to work. Is there more opportunity coming into the downtown other than just residents? The senior population is going to blossom, I guess you could say. In 1946 was the start of the baby boom generation, which went on for about 23 years. So the rate of growth for the next 23 years after that went up at a rate of about 10% to 20% per year because of that baby boom. That baby boom, as of 2016, for the next 23 years, is going to amplify the population from 20% up to 40%. So, sorry. So taking that into consideration, how is that going to affect the growth in the downtown core for the baby boom generation? Is there going to be opportunities for them to move downtown as well? Or is the target going to be strictly students and the party generation downtown, which I'm not objecting to because I'm a young person myself. I love the life. I have a young family that lives downtown. There's a lot of opportunities for all of us. I'm just hoping that in this generation, is there an opportunity for paired living environments for the students, for the seniors, for the families, organically to live together? High rises, they're going to go up everywhere. I'm promoting the growth of the downtown as a whole because we need it. We're in desperate need of the accommodation to allow for the baby boom generation, to allow for the growth of the city. I did some renovations in my home. It's quite an old home. And what I found unique about the house was everything in my house was manufactured in the City of London, remarkably. All of the piping, the knob and tube wiring, the little diodes, absolutely everything was manufactured in London. Everything that I put into the house, there was absolutely nothing manufactured in London, except for me. So just going forward for all of these new buildings and all of the new potential for the city, are we organically taking into consideration what this growth potential allows us to do? Are we going to take the industry that existed and reintroduce it to the city so that we can grow and blossom properly? Or is it going to be dysfunctional and imbalanced? And I think there's an opportunity to take all of these things into consideration moving forward. So in being part of and directly associated with the RHINO, which is the Random Residential High-Rise Intensification Narrow Outliner, being an acronym, it's an opportunity to really take into consideration more than what we are considering right now with the official plan process, with the consulting that we've already had done. It's an opportunity to take another crystal ball look and alter the trajectory of what we're establishing right now. Like right now, we are getting the foundations in, which is important. The momentum is just about to kick off. and it's already started, and I'm all support of that. But we have to consider much more of the residential infill and the balance of the industry versus the residents. What opportunity is there for them moving forward? Thank you for the opportunity to speak.
Thank you. Thanks very much. That was right on 5 minutes, so good job. We have someone over here. Seats. Sorry. Anybody else who would like to make a comment? We have 4 open microphones. I'm not seeing anybody jumping up out of their seats. I think we have, everyone has commented who wished to comment. So I will ask the committee to close the public participation meeting. Moved by Councillor Hopkins, seconded by Deputy Mayor Helmer, and I'll call the vote. So I have a few questions that I've written down. There were a few people that asked about how the secondary plan for Victoria Park will trump the Heritage Conservation District or the Woodfield plan.
So through you, Madam Chair. So the Victoria Park secondary plan doesn't trump the West Woodfield or the Downtown Heritage Conservation District plans. These documents are intended to be read together. We are proposing to amend the Woodfield neighborhood specific policy that's in the 1989 official plan and the London plan to add the clarity about how the Victoria Park secondary plan would be applied. That includes also modifying references for the block that encompasses the North Policy area, because there was previously a site-specific amendment that is referred to in those neighborhood-specific policy areas that allows for 5 stories on those sites, or in that block that is being amended through the secondary, would be amended through the secondary plan. But it just, I mean, the Woodfield neighborhood-specific policy area is much larger than the secondary plan, so it's just adding that clarity when they're read together, because that neighborhood-specific policy area is in the official plan, that the secondary plan would sort of take precedence over it if there was any conflict, which we don't see. Furthering that, so the West Woodfield and Downtown Heritage Conservation Districts would continue to be read in tandem. You'd be still be required to submit heritage impact assessments. Any demolition permits would still be required. Also, we did have ERA. They're a planning consulting firm that specializes in heritage planning. They're nationally known. We had them do a peer review of the secondary plan, just in terms of those heritage policies. So they found it was consistent with the PPS and that it didn't conflict with the West Woodfield Heritage Conservation District plan or the Downtown Heritage Conservation District plan. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you. So it doesn't conflict with the Heritage Conservation District. Were there any specifics in the Woodfield neighborhood plan that you know of that do conflict with the Victoria Park secondary plan?
Sorry, so that is, it's a specific policy area. It's sort of a series of policies in the London plan and the 1989 official plan. And the only sort of direct area of conflict, which we are proposing to amend, is in the I believe it's in the 1989 official plan. I don't think it carried through into the London, no, it is in both. We did have to amend some of the wording with relation to the North policy area, because it previously had a site-specific amendment on it that would allow for essentially medium density residential, and so that would be removed through that Woodfield, or through the amendment to the Woodfield neighborhood-specific policies, and then adding in the language about the secondary plan taking priority if there was a conflict.
Mr. Bear?
Through the chair, and I think perhaps just to provide a little bit of clarification to the, as Ms. Canarium said, there is no trump of one over the other. There are some places where there are some differences, and part of this, though, goes back to the vintage and the development of the West Woodfield plan. It's a 2008 plan. There is one area in the plan where, and this is part of the problem, because the way that the plan was written back in 2008, it is not prescriptive, it's actually very descriptive. And one example is 510-2, the City Hall precinct. And the trouble is that it uses words like perhaps including, and maybe should consider, perhaps. So it provides some direction and guidance, but it's not been written to the same degree or to the same rigor where we would write a new one. The Downtown Heritage Conservation District plan is a much more contemporary plan. The interface that it speaks to is primarily the southern interface. And in this instance, there really isn't that same inconsistency between them, but certainly there are some things that one could read in the West Woodfield plan that might seem to be at odds with this, but I think as Ms. Canarium said, you still have to consider these. We still refer you back to this. And in fact, the recommendation that's coming forward as part of the secondary plan is to actually clarify the need for the heritage impact assessment, which is under the policies of the London plan, which gives you a little bit more comparison when you're doing those evaluations. I think that's all I'll say to this one specifically right now.
Great, thank you. I wonder if you know, if you've have had the opportunity to find out how many 30-story buildings there are in downtown London. I think I know the answer, but I'll let you.
We were struggling with that one. Right now, there's one under construction. So as developed as 30 stories, they're not. However, the current official plan and the current zoning bylaw speaks to building heights, and it speaks to 90 meters. So we do have buildings that are at that maximum that would be an equivalent if they were built at residential heights at the 3 meters per floor, that they would be at that 30 stories. But 30-story buildings, none, one under construction. 30-story heights, yes, one London Place being one right off the top.
Thank you. I had a question if there's, through this secondary plan, any consideration in the plan about affordable housing?
So through you, Madam Chair. So we do have in the sustainability section, building sustainable development in 3.9, policy D, in terms of that encourages, so it's the provision of a mixture of unit types, including the provision of 2- and 3-story units, is encouraged to allow a variety of families to live in the core. So that helps to lend itself in terms of providing a wider range of housing options. In terms of affordability, the bonusing provisions that were previously in the draft plan were removed in the revised plan, just in light of the changes to the Planning Act and that removal of that bonusing criteria, which currently I believe is scheduled to be sort of moving away from that as of January 1st of 2021. But we still, in that interim, do have Section 37 of the Planning Act, so we still could get that bonusing for anything that came in up until that time. And then after that time, we would have the community benefits charge, and so these developments in this plan would still be subject to that, which may include some affordable housing component.
So are there any concerns about sanitary servicing for any of the developments that might potentially take place?
So through you, Madam Chair, that would be reviewed through any specific applications that came in. In the R tools section, so it's AV, it indicates that servicing studies and sanitary design briefs may be required to ensure adequate servicing, and then holding provisions may be required to ensure an adequate servicing is in place prior to development. So those are requirements for any zoning bylaw amendments that come into the area.
Do we have any silhouette policies around the Basilica?
We do not, sorry, through you, Madam Chair, we do not have any silhouette policies for the Basilica. The Basilica is Part 5 designated. It is, there could, it isn't Part for designated. It still has the same sort of level of designation under the Ontario Heritage Act, but we do not have any silhouette policies for it.
Okay, so the final thing that I wrote down is about design standards. So a number of people spoke about the possibility of parking garages being at street level, and there were a number of different comments that I wrote down around design standards, and I wondered if you would speak to that and what design standards are in the plan.
Thanks. So we have a number of design standards in the plan. We do have requirements for any at-grade parking to be wrapped with other uses. We have requirements for sort of requiring these active ground floors. We have a maximum lobby width, really to ensure that we also, if you've got a residential building, you have individual units that are also at grade to really have that activity. So yes, you could, while below grade parking is, it should be provided. In some instances, there may be above grade parking, but we do have policies for wrapping and also for access. So it's sort of taken away from fronting onto the park and Richmond Street, really just to continue to have a very positive public realm. We also have a number of design features in terms of step backs and tower separation distances, and limiting floor plate sizes, which will also help to really improve that pedestrian experience in terms of shadow, in terms of wind, in terms of the perceived massing of the buildings, and access to sunlight. We also have a variety of facade design policies. There's a whole host of design policies in this plan that really focus on recognizing how important Victoria Park is, that the buildings that are built here, they need to be of a higher standard of design than we would generally require elsewhere in the city. Recognizing that this is such an important resource and that anything built next to it really needs to complement the park.
And really quickly, can you just put in layman's terms what wrapping is?
So wrapping would mean that that you can't see the parking from when you're a pedestrian on the ground floor. So it would be in behind other uses, so that when you're walking along the sidewalk, you're not next to a blank wall, you're not next to parking, you're next to residential units or a lobby or commercial uses or an entrance to an office. So it's something that you don't feel like you're next to parking because there's something separating you and parking.
Great, thank you. Okay, so really quickly, committee, because there's only 3 of us today, all 3 must always be present. We usually have 5 or 6 at committee, so nobody has been able to leave and take a refreshment break at any type. So we're just going to have a brief 5-minute recess, and then committee will be right back. And it's moved by the Deputy Mayor for a 5-minute recess, seconded by Councillor Hopkins. We'll just do a hand vote, all in favor, and that passes unanimously. So we will be back here at 6:18. Okay, it's 5 minutes. We can get started if everyone will take their seats. Okay, we're back. So I'll go to committee. Councillor Hopkins.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I might as well start this off. I'm not even sure where to go. I've been just writing madly here, listening to all the comments. I want to thank everyone for coming out with their comments. It feels almost like we've just started this process, and I know we're coming to an end of this process. One of the things I've heard here loud and clear is that we haven't had enough time to digest this report, and we also need to refer it back for further consultation. So that's something I've heard loud and clear. Because I think we've still got a lot more work to be done, maybe from some of these comments. I even know from reading the report, there's still some unfinished work to be done, such as the corridors, looking at the public space near City Hall, things like that. So I'm really appreciative of the comments because I think they were valid. There was a lot of valid points made here. One of the big items for me, and I'm going to really just to kind of digest all my notes here because I've been scribbling so madly, is that the community engagement part. So I'm just trying to see where we are in the process here, and maybe I'll go through you, Madam Chair, to staff, just understanding that if we refer it back, then what happens with this process moving forward? And will we be at the same point when a report comes out, it comes out towards the end of the week, and then it's heard at planning a few days later. Just wondering if I can have, if we have any movement there, or how would it look if we refer this back?
Ms. Canary.
Okay, perfect. Thanks. So through you, Madam Chair. So we have had extensive engagement on this project. We've had 3 community information meetings, all of which have been quite well attended. One of which we sort of launched the study, one we presented the draft principles, and one we presented the draft plan. We have had a Get Involved website. We've been out at summer festivals, both in 2018 and 2019. In 2019, we had a virtual reality model that we brought with us of the draft plan. And we also had a session at City Hall where people could drop by to look at the model. We've also had meetings with various stakeholders and landowners as requested. And community members, anyone who's really requested a meeting with us. We've had multiple meetings with many of these parties as requested. So I mean, if we were sort of to be referred back, I think it would be really important for us to get direction as to what changes we need to be looking to make, because we have had a lot of feedback about height. As you've heard here today, it's very varied. So when we've come to this, we've looked at the area, we've looked at the planning framework that exists, we've looked at the provincial policies, and we've heard all the feedback, which has helped to inform what's in the report. But I definitely, if we are to be sent back, it would be good to know what we're further consulting on and what changes council will be looking for. Mr. Barrett's going to take this.
Go ahead, Mr. Barrett.
Through the chair, and just to put it in, the second part of the councillor's question with respect, are we going to be at the same point if we come back? That unfortunately I think is a consequence of our process where we prepare a report to go on your agenda. The report is released publicly on the Wednesday before the meeting. That's where we are. We don't like to put stuff out that you don't see. And so we've had this conversation before where, we get your leave to put stuff out for a little bit longer, but then that's a disadvantage to you as a council because you don't have it in your hands to be able to respond to what you might be hearing from the public. So I'm not too sure how we're going to fix that part, but I think we can go a long way to fixing that part if, as Ms. Canarium had suggested, you're very specific in your referral back to us so that the public understands what you're asking us to look at, and you've given us some direction as to what you would like to see. And I guess the last point I would like to say is, with respect to staff, we don't have an issue with a referral. This, as a lot of people, well, actually everybody tonight has noted, this is the jewel of the city's park system. It's a jewel in the heart of all Londoners. And I think it's in everybody's best interest that we get it right. And so a referral back is not a bad thing. But with that referral, in order to also address those concerns that you heard, which is we see it on Wednesday, we talk about it on Monday, we're still going to have that compression. But if folks understand what they're going to see on Wednesday to talk about on Monday with some specific direction, I think that will help us.
Thank you very much for those comments, Mr. Barrett, and through the chair. I really appreciate them. I know, you know, the challenge I have as a committee member is supporting intensification and then protecting this jewel of a park. And it is a balance, and there's a lot to consider as we move forward. I will just make notes, and I'm just going to consider your comments. But one of the things I do appreciate about what is in the report right now, and it's very, just made a quick list of the green roofs. I think that is something that we as a city are moving forward on, and really, really good to see that in place. The mixed use is part of it as well. It's just not going to be retail. It's going to be more than that. And the design standard as well. I do think we're going to be keeping these buildings to a higher standard, which I think is important as we move forward. Also the public realm part, I think that's really, really important. And I think the plan speaks to that. And if we can do more or not, but how important these buildings are going to work within the realm. The corridors as well. Again, there's a lot of, we're not completely sure how these corridors are going to work as well, but I think the corridors is something that will help open up the park to the public as well. So I'll just leave these comments for now.
Anyone else? Deputy Mayor Hellner?
Thank you. I got a couple of questions sort of on the substance of what's in the secondary plan, and then I think talking about timelines and what have you for a referral, if that's what's the direction of the committee and council. I think I have some questions about that. So there was a question raised by somebody who spoke in the PPM about affordability. And in this area, we do have a rapid transit corridor in the official plan. And for the purposes of inclusionary zoning, does that rapid transit corridor and the stops that are planned along the rapid transit corridor count as a major protected transit station where you could have inclusionary zoning?
Through the chair, certainly that's something that is being looked at. We actually are looking at that in general, the permissions afforded and the opportunities for inclusionary zoning as part of protected major transit station areas and the corridors. We actually have that on our work plan to report back to you on, and the use of those tools that may be available by making those declarations. We got a timeline on that?
Through the chair, I'll just add that the province has specific requirements for what makes up a major protected transit station area. So it requires that there be an identified minimum height and density, a minimum density in terms of workers or jobs and people per hectare overall for the area. So none of our rapid transit stations are classified currently, but we're looking at that project to potentially introduce that to the London plan, which would allow us to in the future take advantage of inclusionary zoning. The timing of that still to be determined, likely sort of late summer, fall, we'll be reporting back.
Thank you. I thought that was an important thing to just raise because I know it's sort of in progress, and my understanding was it wasn't all in the London plan. They changed it afterwards. we approved the London plan, and then they came up with the requirements around minimum density and number of jobs, et cetera. But okay, in the diagram that's in the report, it shows a lot of overlapping boundaries. Obviously, I'm sure everyone who's working on this project is tired of seeing all these different boundaries and maps. One of the ones that doesn't show up very often is the DC grant boundary, which sort of stops like at City Hall. I think it includes the Great West Lifelands that are south of Dufferin. It includes where the Old Oak building is going up now, but nothing really north of that, I don't think. That's not contemplated to be moving at all as part of this.
So through you, Madam Chair, we're not contemplating to move that through the secondary plan at this time.
Separate from the secondary plan. Any other contemplations around moving that?
Through the chair, no, that boundary is contiguous with the area that's defined as the downtown, and we're not looking at making any amendments to that through this or any other process at this point.
Okay, thank you. I want to talk a lot more about the 45-degree angular plane part of the permitted heights. This is new. It's obviously new to the community there's been a lot of discussion around heights, but then they see it for the first time really in this draft of the plan, right, with the final proposed plan and the 45-degree angle. So can we have a bit more discussion and commentary about where else this is being used, how we see it implemented and effectively being implemented in other jurisdictions? Because I think it's an interesting approach, but it would be novel in London. And I think sometimes I've felt it being applied in the background when we're dealing with some recommendations around heights. I think this would be consistent to what we've seen for a lot of recommendations recently anyway, in terms of heights where there was impacts on surrounding areas. But I just want to know more about it. So I don't know if it's Ms. Knierim or somebody else, but on this 45-degree angular plane piece specifically.
So through you, Madam Chair. So the 45-degree angular plane is a common tool that's used throughout the country and throughout Ontario. So I know Ottawa uses it for looking at designing tall buildings. Guelph has a component of it. Barrie also uses it. City of Toronto uses it in their mid-rise building design guidelines. It's sort of, in general, we often see this 45-degree angular plane as a commonly accepted urban design standard. There are slight modifications in how that's applied. Certain municipalities, such as what we're proposing here, will take it sort of from either the property line of either a residentially zoned or residentially designated property, and then we'll go up to sort of the average height of a single detached dwelling, which is what we're doing here, which is the 10.5 meters that's allowed in the zoning. And then you go up that 45 degrees. Some will take it just straight from the property line without going up with that additional height. We chose to add that, to go up from that 10.5 meters, just recognizing that this is in the central area and the idea that you could expect a single detached dwelling to be built adjacent to your single detached dwelling. And also so essentially the idea being that as you have this development fall within this angular plane, it helps to improve access to light, shadow, overlooks, sky views, and the visual impact of the massing. So you have these tall buildings, you have these mid-rise buildings, but it's not as if you're right next to one. It helps to make it so that it fits better within its context.
So that's helpful. Has this sort of approach in these places, in Ontario anyway, has it been evaluated to see how it works? You know, one of the vulnerabilities I could see with it is that, say you have a bunch of residential designated land, and property developers are putting together an assembly because they want to build something bigger. If they need to remove the buildings adjacent to them, more of them, because they want the line to start somewhere further away, I could see it resulting in like more land acquisition, more demolition, and more conversions in advance of the big build. So you know, this sort of relative thing where it says, well, we'll start here. I mean, that works when it's residential, but I think it's tricky if it's not, and it can change. So I wonder if, like in practice, how does that actually work? Do people start doing what I'm talking about or not?
So through Madam Chair, so I've only ever seen it applied when it's adjacent to low-rise residential. And the Woodfield neighborhood in the West Woodfield Heritage Conservation District Plan and the London Plan Vision for that area and the 89 Plan Vision, they sort of, as the base designation is that it would be residential. And so that's why we were looking at it, we said, do we go with the zoning? Do we go with the official plan? The idea being that the official plan is more firm in the direction of how the area should evolve in the future, because certain municipalities will just base it on zoning. But in order to have that certainty, so you're not seeing someone come in advance and just rezone a property or do something like that, that's why we've based it on that official plan designation to help add that additional certainty and prevent certain changes happening in advance of someone coming in with an application.
And it seems like for the same reason, this is why you're suggesting a 10.5. This is the starting point. It doesn't matter what's there now, is we're going to start at 10.5 no matter what.
So through Madam Chair, yes. And it also, right now, they're primarily sort of single detached forms. So that 10.5 meters is reflective of the character. And so it seems as if it's a fair place to start.
I'm not sure. I had a couple of questions for Mr. Stapleton. I don't know if he's still here. I can't see. Like he's behind the screen. Do you mind? Okay. You had a couple of slides there. You're going fast because you're trying to squeeze in the presentation. There's one that had rental licenses up on the screen. It's from CityMap. Was the suggestion there that you could go taller because there was more people renting?
No, it was to illustrate the transitional nature of the neighborhood, that it wasn't a stable neighborhood, that these elements on the periphery of downtowns and cores lead to the incremental evolution of the core and density and intensification, and that's the initial steps. So you see the initial steps of this on the periphery. So that was to show that you don't have a stable single-family residential neighborhood. It's transitioning to something else. The current zoning allows a multitude of, I'll say, more medium density types of uses like multiplexes, triplexes, fourplexes, things of that nature, as well as offices. And that's what it's transformed to. So the evolution of downtowns, what you have is, because of its proximity to areas and that has the locational attributes, more people want to stay there. So because you don't need and because of our proximity to open space, you don't need your rear yards for your private amenity space. You use it over there. You can densify your property and have parking in the rear yards because you have the benefit of a public open space next door. So these types of things happen in these types of areas in every city, and you'll see it, but this is one of the initial steps. This has been there for a while now, but you'll see it proliferate a little bit on these stressed areas, I'll call them, on the transformation of adjacent areas when you have these types of amenities. Okay. Oh, sorry.
Sorry, thank you. And that sounded very similar to what you said when you were doing your presentation, so I appreciate you driving that point home. I'm specifically asking about the rental license map that you popped up and how that's supportive of greater heights, because, the build form is pretty stable with the addition of a few apartment buildings. Mostly what's happened is conversions and different uses, and so you put up something showing the tenure of people who are living in the housing that supports more height, so more renters. You could go higher?
There we go. Yes, it does, because you speak to the stability of the neighborhood. Because the impacts of height are measured against the neighborhood in this case, because you have that transitional nature, you have less impacts because you're only impacting, or you're impacting less areas for parking, and these types of rear yard transformations. So yes, it does inform height because the impacts are less. If you can't measure the sensitivity to the abutting lands, you can't really determine height. That's why we're in this quandary, because people are stuck with some sort of romantic notion that this is a stable single family, just because of the low-rise nature of this building dwelling, doesn't mean that it's a stable neighborhood. And because of that, because of the transitional nature, the height implications of land next to it minimizes the impacts, or that minimizes the impacts of height. So this relationship between transitional neighborhoods and height absolutely corresponds. If this was, and I use this in some of my correspondence, if this is on your transit corridor on Oxford Street, where you have immediately single-family homes with private amenity spaces, but you're still allowing 12 to 16 stories of height, and that means good land use planning. It certainly does in a transitional neighborhood. So that's the point I'm trying to make. If you want intensification, do it where you're doing the less harm to these, to the expectation of private amenity space, right? You want it in the core, you have all the facilities, you all have the amenities, you're close to employment, you're close to open space, you hit all the checkpoints. That's why it should happen here. There shouldn't be a question about this side of the street for sure, because your shadows are less. All that's less on the east side, especially in this location. The west side, that's a different story. Oh, sorry.
Thank you. So just for what it's worth, I don't think showing that slide was very helpful to your argument. If you wanted to talk about the outside private amenity space, I think you should have focused on that. The nature of the people who are living in the area, whether they're renters or not, is not really material to the argument you're making, and I think it's actually implying some things that are not good.
I'm sorry you think that way, but it was just to talk about the density. So the density, when we have the multifamily home or dwelling units, so they have been converted to multiple apartment units. That means the rear yards were transformed from the private amenity space to parking, so that density could be accommodated. And that's what I'm referring to when you see the licenses to multifamily homes. So that was the purpose of the exercise.
Yeah, so this is for our staff, just through the chair. In terms of the timeliness of proceeding with the secondary plan, I know it's been underway for a long way. One thing I'd like to avoid is at the very end, moving ahead when there's pretty strong desire to refer for contradictory reasons. So we have people who want very different things, who both or all want a referral. How much time are we really working with? This seems to me like the secondary plan in particular is something that's going to probably get appealed depending on how it lands. And we already have some policies in place, right, through the current official plan, from the London plan, for the policies that are in effect. We have, as Mr. Pramel pointed out, a site plan approval that is coming in this particular area. So I'm open to the idea of a referral, but I want to understand what the real world consequences of having it come back on the 17th of February versus the 9th of March versus, the 23rd of March, whatever the next planning meeting is after that, what you would recommend in terms of a timeline and what the community and everyone who's interested in this could expect, because I think we're going to have another public participation meeting. I think, especially people who are saying, listen, I haven't had a lot of time to look at it. Myself, I only read it on Saturday. I got it on Wednesday, but I was in budget Thursday, Friday. I didn't read it until Saturday. So I sympathize with that, and I think people are going to want to be able to weigh in. So I think even if we didn't give direction on changing things, having a pause is a good idea. I just want to think about when specifically it would be coming back to planning.
Through the chair, short answer is back to the comment I made earlier, which is we want to get this right. So we can take the time. We can certainly be back before the summer. I wouldn't want it to be within 3 sessions or 4 sessions. You've got budget coming up. We've got to, as we've heard, some talking to do with members of the community on all sides of the issue. So somewhat based on what you're actually going to refer back and the nature of the referral. But I would suggest to you that we would like to get back to you before the summer and before we don't do these kinds of things with the public. So that would be sometime May, June, that we could come back to you. And that would hopefully give us enough time to have some ongoing discussion. And as I said, also based on what you actually refer back to us could play into that.
Well, I think just among, I'm done for questions, I think, but just in terms of discussion amongst the committee, you know, I think heights is obviously the one where we have really different opinions about what should be happening, and I think that's got to be a focus of the discussion. I'm sure our planning staff would like us to give some direction about like specifically this or that. I actually think that just sending it back to have more discussion with people, especially with the 45-degree angular plane, like what that really means. I think some people have a very good understanding of what that means because they can model it and they can see what's going to happen and they're perhaps more familiar with it. We have at least had it in the Old East Village on part of it. There's a 45-degree angular plane. It's not totally unheard of, but I think especially for the community members, you know, who might not have 3D modeling just at their fingertips to see what things could look like, what the difference is between a 45-degree angle and something lower, starting at a different place, like those kind of things. I think people have to wrap their heads around that. So I think height for sure needs to be looked at, although I don't really want to give a direction around changing specific things, which I'm sure planning staff will not appreciate. And I do think the issue around affordability, I know we have general policies in the London plan, which is why I think in a lot of the secondary plans, we don't have specific policies around affordability, but I think that's something that should be considered again, sort of second thought on that, especially if we're going to go with the maximum density or the higher density levels, how that interacts with the planned RT corridor that's right beside on sort of the west side of this area. I think that's one that needs to be discussed a bit more. And even if it was to re-articulate some of the policies that already exist in the London plan, I think it might make it more obvious to people what could be happening in this area in terms of affordability. So those are the two that really stick for me. In terms of active transportation, I know that was another one that was brought up. Again, we do have policies in the London plan that are quite supportive of active transportation, and I'm not sure what specifically we want to add into this secondary plan about that. And maybe there were some ideas raised around bicycle parking and things like that, but I'm not sure about that one in terms of providing it as a direction for further discussion. I will say, just briefly, I know there's a lot of disagreement about heights and some of the view impacts, but I do think overall the plan is pretty good. So there's a lot of great stuff in there, and I don't want that to be lost. You know, that we weren't arguing about every single thing in there. It was just a few key things that are very important, I think. But I think there's a lot of agreement that most of the plan is very good.
So I'm just going to jump in here because I know we have Councillor Van Holst and Councillor Hopkins that want to get back in on this. I have a question about the view plane thing. So I'm wondering, are there areas, and in particular, I'm wondering about the North Block, but it could be in other areas as well. So you have the 45-degree angle view plane thingy, and then we also have in certain areas up to certain heights of buildings. Are there any of these areas where those two things kind of conflict? So I wrote it down in particular for the North Block. It may come into play as well for the shadowing over the band shell, but could there be areas where we've said it could be up to this many stories, but given this 45-degree angle, are there any areas where it makes it impossible to reach that maximum height? Have you looked at it in that kind of detail?
So thanks. Yeah, so we have looked at it. We've done extensive modeling. So actually on the City Hall lands, because of where you would take the angular plane from, which would be in sort of behind Central, you could go up much higher. So that was why, because we still want to transition as you're heading north down in height. So that's why we've added the 30-story cap. Similarly, on the south portion of 556 Wellington, that parking lot, within the angular plane, you could get 30 maybe a 31st story, but the 30th story, the upper stories are shaped a little bit in terms of how big the floor plate could be by that angular plane, but it's still a very realistic and developable floor plate, but again, cap that at 30 in terms of that transition in height. In the north block, where it comes, sort of the northern part of the 556 Wellington parking lot and the Auburn site can fit within that angular plane. There's no height limit specified for those. We've modeled it as approximately 8 stories because it would end up in and around there. And then in the north policy area, so where you run into there is it's sort of the eastern part, or the western part of that that block is in the rapid transit corridor place type. And in the London plan, if you're in the rapid transit corridor place type, it allows for the consolidation of lots. And when you consolidate your lots, it allows some flexibility in the interpretation of that rapid transit corridor place type boundary. So right now, those lots are not consolidated, and there's a parking lot in the interior. So right now, those without the consolidation of those properties, the single detached dwellings that sort of ring the site on the south, north, and east, you'd have to take the angular plane from the back of those properties. But if you were to consolidate them, then you could take it from the neighborhood place types that are sort of on the, I guess, the north side of Hyman, the east side of Wellington, and then from there, that would allow you to have up to 16 stories in the center of the block. That's the only area in the plan where sort of there's that adjacency with the rapid transit corridor and neighborhood place type that could allow for that interpretation. But we have done extensive modeling to make sure that the angular planes and where we have capped the heights, that you can fit that capped height within the angular plane. Similar with the shadow work, with the shadows on the concrete pad in front of the band shell.
So, but the homes along Central, those are the ones that are currently on the registry as listed?
Yeah, so those are the ones that are in the registry as listed, and we would be recommending be considered for designation. But regardless of whether or not the lots were consolidated, that wouldn't impact the ability to really demolish or do anything to those dwellings, because it would just be that they would be under a singular property. But those buildings and the heritage merits and the heritage status of those buildings would continue to run with the property and need to be considered with any development that happened in the interior.
Okay, so I have another question about this, the length of time between when the report will be released and then the planning committee that follows. And I understand what Mr. Barrett is saying. How does this report get into the hands of the interested parties? Do you have an email list? Are they sent a link to the city website? Because I know it came out Wednesday afternoon and was on the website as of Wednesday afternoon.
Yeah, so through you, Madam Chair. So we send out an email blast to all of our interested parties that has the link to the website. And I specifically, when I sent it out with the notice of public meeting, said, here's the link to the city's meeting site, and here's the link to the website. These should be updated as of approximately noon on Wednesday, I believe it was January 28th. So that information, that was how they were aware that that was coming and where they could find it. We did send out, for people who don't have the internet, just the notice of public meeting, but we didn't include those links because it was just a hard copy. But in most cases, almost all cases, the individuals who were getting hard copies were also getting the emails.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Van Holst.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. You always have a challenging committee because there's dozens of perspectives that come forward. Mine will be the availability of housing. So essentially, the bigger the better, really. We need more housing. Our plan with the London plan was to build inward and upward. This is the most inward place, so we should be thinking of upward. A 30-story building can house 3 times as many people as a 10-story building. And the reason I think that's important is because half an hour before your meeting, a woman called me in tears and she can't find housing because the place where she was renting was purchased by a new owner who kicked them out. Coincidentally, both her granddaughter and her son had a similar thing happen. Now they're all holed up at her sister's place in a tiny house in my ward, trying to find housing. The more housing we build downtown, the more we'll have people move into that. It'll just provide more housing everywhere. So that's going to be my focus. I'll be pushing for us to move in those directions. Wanted to make a couple other points about it. I like that we saw a bit of a virtual reality, and that was something I'd asked for, and maybe through you to staff. I know that staff had actually put together a virtual reality program, and there's a point I was going to make an appointment to come and see it, but then I got distracted with some other things this year. So is that available? Are we able to come and view that?
So through Madam Chair, we do not have that available at this time for the revised secondary plan, but if we are referred back and have further consultation, we are definitely able to prepare that. The draft plan is still available for viewing though in the VR set as a point of reference.
Okay, thank you. That would be great, because we hear opinions, oh, this will be terrible, this will be great. I know someone said, how would you feel about these buildings? But when I saw the demonstration on video, I was exhilarated. I thought it's great. I think that this is what's going to make London better. I think that's what's going to frame the park very nicely. It's going to bring people downtown, which is going to build our economy down here. People complain in my area and say, I don't even go downtown. I don't want to go downtown. Well, it's going to be better if we have people down here. This is what will make it great. I think if we were to start from scratch, we would probably give preference to the developments along Victoria Park as opposed to the Woodfield. The idea of transitional or a neighborhood in transition seemed to make perhaps a little more sense to me. The impacts are less if there's a parking lot than if there's a pool in a yard. I'm going to worry less about the shadows on that. And because it's transition, I suspect that we'll see some changes as a result of these buildings as well. Some people in the neighborhood renting are probably going to move into them. Certainly it's the case if Councillor Helmer's, Deputy Mayor Helmer's suggestion of having affordable units in these was there. And I also suspect that we'll see a transition as some of those, although I wouldn't want to be forcing somebody out of their place. I suspect that somebody may say, well, I don't want to live here anymore because the shadows in the evening, and then a business might want to move in because they don't really care about the shadows in the evening, and then we're using it as a commercial property, which is what we see around here anyway. So I think that the future of the Victoria Park and the neighborhood won't be as dire as some people are suggesting, and I think it could turn out to be great. As far as the angular planes, I wonder, I'll be glad to hear some more about that too. I'm concerned about just unintended consequences in a way. I think I would rather just make the determination on height. We don't do so many of them that trying to bake in a policy like this is necessarily the best way to go. I would like staff to bring us some data on the cost effectiveness of green roofs. We have asked for a report to come back from staff, which is going to be the Q4 of 2020, on best practices for green energy investments, and I have a feeling that this one in particular does not deliver what people think it does. I mean, they're kind of hypnotized by the idea. It's a nice sounding one, but I'll point out our last provincial government was almost annihilated for untenable green energy policies, and I don't want us forcing those on developers. So if that really does something in terms of sequestering carbon or removing a heat island, I would like to see some numbers for that. So it's very clear that that's the case. I think that's most of my comments, but I do hope that we'll support, in some cases, even more height. I'm a little disappointed that of the three proposals that I've seen to come forward to build something around this, we've told two of them that they're too high, when I liked them both, and I think they would both be valuable additions to this area. Thank you.
Councillor Hopkins.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I apologize if I'm going to probably reiterate a few things here that have already been said, but I would probably like to underline the height as we move forward. Not so much as going high, but that missing middle. I understand already downtown we've approved applications for high intensity, understanding all that and understanding how we develop around the Victoria Park. When it comes to height, I think that missing middle should be looked at a little bit more, as well as the bonusing. When I read the report, I was really pleased to hear or see that the bonusing is going to be removed. But as we talk about affordable housing, which was really not dealt with in the plan in a broader way, and I think we've heard here tonight the importance of affordable housing. How can we sort of understand the bonusing? I know the review with Bill 108 is still proceeding, which becomes challenging, but again, it's the importance of what we're doing here with this plan and understanding bonusing, affordable housing, inclusionary zoning, along transit routes, how all that comes into play is something that is important for us to understand. The impacts too, and again, I can understand the challenge of the lack of sun and wind and shadowing and how all that works, but trying to understand a little bit more of those impacts is very important. I think it really has something to be said about how it affects all of us and how we live and work downtown. The other thing I wanted to bring to your attention to is the intensification part of the wear and tear on the park. You know, that's probably very difficult to sort of say, well, you know, so many people results in so much grass lost, but just a better understanding, because I know attending Victoria Park events in the summertime, they're great. We have thousands of people down there, and the Monday, the park looks a little different. It does regenerate itself, but will it regenerate itself best with all the other impacts of the sun and wind and all that? I don't think we should dismiss that, and having a better understanding. And one last thing, the parking, just understanding a better how parking works with these buildings that we're going to be bringing forward. Are we talking about just parking for the people, the residences in the buildings, or are we talking about public parking as well? Not sure if we have I think we could have a better understanding on the parking of the Victoria secondary plan. I think that's it.
So it looks like we're getting close to a decision point. Councillor Deputy Mayor Helmer made a number of suggestions for the referral. I agree with the height thing, that's definitely something that needs to be further engaged with the community, but community needs to understand that not everybody is going to be completely in love with the final result. There's going to be, and there has been a lot of work done on this. I agree with the Deputy Mayor that this is a really good document. I really appreciate the report itself. Some people are going to want like super high heights, and some people are not going to want anything above 2 stories. And obviously we can't please everybody. Not everybody's going to be happy. And one thing, I believe the Deputy Mayor said he didn't really want to be prescriptive about what the heights should be. But I do think that particular attention should be paid to the Basilica site. I do agree with many of the comments about, and there are places, especially in Toronto, where they have done a pretty good job of incorporating beautiful old heritage sites with taller buildings. So I just want to make sure that the plan, and I do notice that this plan is different from an earlier draft where there were suggestions of quite a tall building directly east of the Basilica. And I do wanted to recognize that has changed in this plan compared to an earlier draft of the plan. So I just want to make sure that there's a lot of sensitivity given to heights around or directly adjacent to the Basilica. And Deputy Mayor mentioned about active transportation and that there are policies in the London plan, and I wasn't sure whether we should have something quite specific in this secondary plan. I don't think it's a bad idea to have reference to active transportation because of the location, because it's Victoria Park, and a lot of people walk around that area, cycle. It is an area that is attractive for active transportation, so I don't think it would be harmful to actually be pretty specific about that in there. Those are my comments. Obviously, it appears that committee is leaning towards referral. I'm looking to my 2 committee members for a motion. Councillor Hopkins.
Yes, I would like to refer the Victoria Park secondary plan back to staff for further review. Okay. Taking into account the comments heard from the committee.
So Deputy Mayor, you would be seconding this. Would you like to see any refinement of the motion, or are you happy with that? Deputy Mayor.
Well, I'm going to try and be a bit more specific than that. But I do think permitted heights, we have to sort of mention a couple of things we want the focus to be on. Permitted heights, housing affordability. The third one I actually want to add, and I'm open to other ideas, but I think those are the ones I'm interested in particularly. I have to ask some questions about it before because it hasn't come up yet, although I think we're all familiar with this issue, and that's around the noise mitigation, sound mitigation around the park. So I think from 2 perspectives. Right now, the policy seems to me to be like not the strongest thing I've ever seen, which is like you have to do a noise study about mitigation. Okay, I mean, I think people probably would have done that anyway. And I wonder to what extent we can require certain kinds of mitigation, because you can build the building in a way where you're really going to deaden the sound from Victoria Park. And I think actually buildings that get added in along the street, as long as they're a certain height, they'll be the mitigation for people behind them, further east, for example. And similarly, the noise from the stage that gets set up at Sunfest, for example, that points north, it creates a lot of noise, and that's in a very specific pattern all the time. And I would be interested to know, like, if we put buildings at a certain height all the way along that streetscape, where's that noise going that it's not going now? And I think we might not be able to be so gentle with those requirements around noise mitigation, I guess, is the issue I'm raising. I don't know what really is possible. The warning clauses is basically like, we're going to ask them to mitigate it, but they probably won't. So we're going to put a warning on there, that you're going to still have to deal with all this noise problem. And I'm concerned about that. We already get a lot of complaints from people who buy downtown, and then they really do not like the noise from the festivals. even just around the corner on Picton, we get complaints sometimes from people who live in that building, and it's nowhere near as close as these buildings would be. And similarly, I think understanding what the impacts would be if those things are filled in with something taller than single-family houses, how that would mitigate the spread, I think that would be helpful. I also added, I sent this language to the clerk, I also added just something around having some kind of presentation of the 3D modeling. I know you did some, but I think showing the alternatives, you know, the medium high, we actually saw that, I think, at a certain point in the community meetings. I think having it here during the presentation at the PPM would be helpful to understand like what does this look like, and especially the shadowing, because I've seen enough shadow studies to know that once everything starts interacting with each other, the differences between these things can be very minor. You know, at certain times of the day where a really tall building, it isn't really adding a whole lot to the shadowing, except in a very specific part of the geography for a very short period of time. And that those short squat buildings can have way bigger impacts, sometimes unexpected impacts on the shadow. And especially in a park that is heavily treed. You know, I want to be able to show like, what does that look like during the summer and what does it look like in the winter? I think those would be very different. And I think people need to see that when we're talking about these issues. So if we can model the max density and then, or the max heights, and then show what that looks like on the shadow impacts. I know that's asking a lot, but I do think it's going to be important because otherwise we're just kind of imagining what we think it might look like. So those are the things I put in the note to the clerk, just to consider those things in the referral.
I wonder if the mover and seconder wouldn't mind, it's probably not necessary, but under the permitted heights, if we even had in brackets, especially around the Basilica, adjacent to the Basilica, is that a problem?
I don't want to put that in. I want all the heights around the whole thing to be looked at and talked about, and I think that includes that area, and I don't want to single it out.
Okay, and they've heard me, so I'm sure they've gotten my message. So I also wanted to mention that I noticed that Ms. Canarium really rushed through to stick with the 5 minutes. And thank you for that. I just wanted to give notice that when this does come back, it's so important. There's so much interest, not just with people that live in the area, that I would allow a longer time for staff to present the plan when it comes back, because I think it's very important that the community sees exactly what's in the plan, and I'll give you the time to do that. I think understanding the design standards as well in your next presentation, and how there won't be blank walls or even like levels of parking around the park, that it will be camouflaged with residential or commercial units directly at street level. Councillor Van Holst.
Yes, Madam Chair, I'm wondering if it's also possible to get an idea of what the economic benefit to downtown would be to the various levels. How many people might be living in the smaller buildings or the taller ones, and what kind of spin-off we could get from that? I believe that would be helpful to me.
Okay, well, we have a motion on the floor, Councillor. Staff have heard that, and hopefully they may be able to give you some kind of information like that, but this has been moved and seconded. Are there any other comments or questions? I'm not seeing any, so I will call the vote.
Closing the vote, the motion passes 3-0.
So that brings us to items for direction, and beginning with 4.1 is a submission from Councillor Hopkins, which is in our agenda. I'm wondering if staff could comment on that. So where we are, we're right in the process of this review and providing comment, and I wonder if staff could let me know where we are.
Certainly, through you, Madam Chair. On the 14th of February, there's a consultation sponsored by the Minister of Environment and Climate, MECP, to review the proposed changes to the Conservation Authorities Act. We reported to you in our initial review on Bill 108 back in May of last year on those proposed changes. We have not been back to you since then, but at that time we noted that under the proposed changes under the report, and I just had it in front of me and I've just gone and lost it. It was here, but we did note that under the Conservation Authorities Act, we spoke to what was going to be coming through in the regulation, and that's where we are right now, is where they are. So what we are intending to do at that consultation is go to hear what the ministry is proposing and what those would be, and we would be reporting back to you of what those proposed changes might be. What we did know when we reported out to you on the Conservation Authorities Act was the issues that were going to be looked at were a description of the primary and mandatory services. In other words, a difference between the mandatory and non-mandatory services. A new subsection about providing municipal programs and the ability of municipalities to buy into those through an agreement with the Conservation Authority, and enters into memoranda of understanding with municipalities about services that they would provide. So that's the nature of what the consultation is right now, and we would be going to hear what's coming from the minister on those points and then reporting back to you at that point.
Okay, thank you. Councillor, would you like to comment?
Yes, and thank you for the comments from staff. The reason I brought this motion forward is I understand, and I agree, I know we had a report back here a while ago as the province reviews Bill 108, they are going through consultations, and this is part of the process, and I wanted to bring this motion forward for one main reason, and the main reason is supporting conservation authorities in the London area. And not to get into the details of non-mandatory and mandatory, I know staff are going there to hear what the province is going to be saying and doing, but I thought this is an opportunity for council to show support for conservation authorities. It's they are reaching out to stakeholders. They will be asking stakeholders about their undertaking to review Bill 108, and they're looking at changes to the roles of conservation authorities. And so for me, it's something, being on the Conservation Authority Board, it's something that I think we as a council can bring forward to staff, acknowledging the importance at that higher level, the importance of protecting people and property and supporting safe development with that watershed approach. And for those who may not be too sure about that watershed approach, it basically means that we all live in the watershed, and the area that drains to the common waterways like streams and lakes and wetlands are individual actions that can directly affect us, and working together to address today's water resource challenges using that watershed approach. So in other words, what we do upstream and what we do downstream does affect one another, and encouraging that approach as the province reviews the roles of CAs be maintained. And again, I'm asking the committee to support conservation authorities. It's really got nothing, this motion does not really talk to the mandatory, non-mandatory. I know the province will be coming up with what is going to be mandatory and what's not going to be mandatory, but really just supporting conservation authorities with that watershed approach. So those are my comments.
Okay, any other comments from committee? Nope. Yes, Deputy Mayor Helmer.
It seems to me like Councillor Hopkins is intending to move a motion, but I haven't heard one yet. Do you want to move a motion, or are we just receiving your correspondence?
My motion is that council supports the protection of people, property, and safe development with a watershed approach to the programs offered by all conservation authorities in the London area.
Deputy Mayor.
Well, I'll support it, although I would say I think we have to be more specific, and I know Councillor Hopkins knows this because she's our representative on AMO, and she's doing a lot of advocacy towards the provincial government on a whole range of fronts, but we have to be, I think, as specific as we can be about what we want to see happen with conservation authorities. You know, just preserve the status quo exactly how it is. If we want to see any kind of changes at all, improvements, more funding, less funding, change mandate, and I think there's still room to do this. This is essentially saying that we support the programs that are offered by the conservation authorities. I think it's focusing in on the core issue of protection of people, property, and safe development. I don't think anyone's going to disagree with that. I think we can pass it without a whole lot of discussion. I think it's a very straightforward kind of motion, but I do think we have to do more than this, and I think Councillor Hopkins recognizes that as well. And I think this is a good thing to have on the books as we're going into all these other discussions that we'll be having with the province and sort of our partners in the conservation authorities.
I just have one question to staff. Will this motion in any way have any effect on the consultations on February 14th?
Through the chair, no, I don't believe it. I think it's the councillor much better than me just enunciated. Council has a decision, another conversation around the role of the conservation authorities. This is supporting their approach to how it is that they do their work, which is the sub-watershed approach, which is not inconsistent with anything that we would be supporting.
Perfect. Okay, it's been moved and seconded. I'll call the vote.
Closing the vote, the motion carries 3-0.
That brings us to the Agricultural Advisory Committee report.
The work plan.
And they've brought us their work plan committee, so we'll be receiving the report and approving the work plan from the advisory committee. So I have a motion from Councillor Hopkins, seconded by Deputy Mayor Helmer. Any comment? I'm not seeing any. I'll call the vote.
Closing the vote, the motion carries 3-0.
We have item 4.3 is the first report of the Trees and Forests Advisory Committee. So they do have an item on their report about our budget. So I believe what we need to do is receive their report and refer the item where they talk about the budget. It's 5.1, city budget and climate change. So refer that item to the multi-year budget discussions, unless someone on committee has a different idea of what we should do with that. That's what I'm recommending. Receive the report, refer that to the multi-year budget. Councillor Hopkins.
Yes, Madam Chair, I have a quick question. By referring it to the multi-year budget, what in effect are we doing, and how will we see this through the multi-year budget process if we refer it?
So if this is what we do and council approves it, then this would go to staff for their consideration when we get to that part of the multi-year budget. Deputy Mayor.
Thank you. I think for clause 5.1, what we should do is receive it. Because, you know, councillors are going to get this information. It's come to us. If we receive it and we pass it on, people read the reports that they're getting from our committee. They're going to see what their feedback is from the advisory committee around specific business cases. By the time it goes through to council, we will have already had budget, like this report goes through to council, we will have already had budget deliberations probably covering these matters. So in some ways it's kind of redundant. We're not going to be able to actually refer it to them before we get through the budget deliberations at SPPC. I think it's better to just receive these clauses. Councillors will be able to read it when they get the report for council. I think that's fine.
Wonderful. Okay, so Deputy Mayor Helmer is moving receipt, and Councillor Hopkins is seconding that. There's no further discussion, so I'll call the vote.
Closing the vote, the motion carries 3-0.
So there are no deferred matters or additional business. It brings us to one confidential item that's on the agenda. I'll ask the clerk to read. First, we need a motion to go in camera. Moved by Councillor Hopkins, seconded by the Deputy Mayor. And I'll get the clerk to read the reason for going in camera, and then we'll vote on that.
This report can be considered in a meeting closed to the public, as the subject matter being considered pertains to advice that is subject to solicitor-client privilege, including communications necessary for that purpose from the solicitor and officers and employees of the corporation. The subject matter pertains to litigation or potential litigation with respect to an appeal at the local planning appeal tribunal, LPAT, and for the purpose of providing instructions and directions to officers and employees of the corporation. Closing the vote, the motion carries 3-0.
So we'll go to Committee Room 3, and we will adjourn from Committee Room 3 after the end of the confidential item.